Hello, my dear friends. They washed in filth, slept in rags, and called decay a form of purity. Beneath cracked hands and layers of dirt, peasant women lived by rituals that made survival look like devotion. Every drop of water was a gamble, every act of care a quiet mistake passed down for generations. What they believed would cleanse them only dragged them deeper into rot, and still they thought it sacred. Tonight, you'll walk through their world, where hygiene was not salvation but surrender. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one could step into the dim cottages of peasant women, the first thing to notice would not be the scent of bread or the smoke from the hearth, but the heaviness of damp cloth hanging near the fire. Beneath those layers of patched garments lay the most forgotten piece of clothing, the coarse linen undergarment that never truly left their skin. It was not a luxury, nor a choice, but a small strip of fabric passed down, repaired, and worn until the threads themselves surrendered. In the villages where every scrap of cloth had value, underwear was a treasure too poor to be discarded. Most women owned one or perhaps two, rotating between them only when one was too wet to wear. The cold air of their homes could not dry it fully, yet they slipped it on again before dawn, the fabric still clinging with yesterday's moisture. Each morning began with that quiet discomfort, a damp reminder that poverty was as close to the body as the skin itself. The fabric was made from sackcloth or leftover flax, thick and unyielding against the softness of flesh. It scraped rather than covered, leaving small abrasions on the inner thighs that never truly healed. Washing it was a rare ordeal. There was no soap, no warm water, only a small basin filled from the river or rain barrel. Sometimes the water had already been used for dishes or livestock. The cloth was dipped, rubbed against a stone, and hung on a line where the wind carried dust from the yard. When the garment dried, it stiffened, its surface gritty and sour with the residue of dirt. Yet for the women, this was ordinary. It was what every woman in the village did, and the pain from the rough cloth was simply another thing to endure. Inside their cottages, privacy barely existed. The same space was shared by men, children, and animals. When a woman crouched to change, she turned her back to the room, adjusting the old waistband with fingers already cracked from labour. The underwear absorbed everything, from sweat to menstrual blood, and because water was scarce, it was often worn for weeks. The odour mixed with smoke, earth, and the sour tang of fermented milk was used for cleaning. It is almost ironic that people who worked so hard to survive could never escape the smell of their own survival. In winter, they might warm the cloth by the fire before putting it on, but the heat only deepened the stench. In summer, the moisture turned into a rash. The fabric became part of the body, inseparable from the life of toil and repetition. Those who lived closer to towns might see finer garments hanging from the windows of merchants' wives and envy their whiteness. But for peasant women, cloth was something borrowed from function, not beauty. They could not afford softness, nor could they imagine owning anything meant purely for comfort. Their undergarments were sewn from whatever was left old sacks that once held grain, sometimes pieces of a curtain or the hem of a dead relative's dress. The result was patchwork protection, stiff and uneven, tied by strings rather than buttons. When it tore, they patched it with scraps that never matched, forming a pattern of poverty stitched directly into the cloth. The discomfort became part of daily motion. As they bent to gather crops or scrub pots, the rough fabric rubbed against their skin, leaving faint red lines that burned under sweat. They did not complain, for the entire village lived the same way. Hygiene was not discussed, and modesty was learned in silence. Mothers taught daughters how to rinse the cloth discreetly at dusk, behind the barn or at the stream. The night air was their curtain, and the sound of a running water their only privacy. If modern people had to live a single day in such garments, most would call it unbearable torture. Yet in those centuries endurance was a virtue, pain was proof of decency, and hardship was the texture of womanhood. Sometimes the undergarments were never fully dry, heavy with trapped moisture. Women went to bed wearing them, lying on straw mats that absorbed both sweat and soil. When illness came, it was often blamed on the weather, not on the bacteria that festered in those damp layers. Rashes became infections, infections became fever, and many suffered in silence. There were no doctors to tell them why. The cloth became both shield and curse, keeping them decent while slowly breaking their skin. There is something deeply human in how people learn to live with pain until they stop noticing it at all. What began as a symbol of modesty turned into a silent burden no one dared question. During harvest seasons, when work lasted from dawn until night, women had no time to clean or change. The undergarments hardened with sweat, the seams digging deeper into their skin. After months of wearing and rewashing, the fabric weakened, tearing at the edges. Only when it finally fell apart would a new one be sewn. But new did not mean clean, meant another old sack repurposed, another fragment of necessity turned garment. The cycle never ended, and no one imagined it could. Cleanliness was for the rich, modesty for the poor, for the peasant women. Even the act of covering themselves was labour. When travelling, preachers passed through villages, and they often spoke about purity, not realising how literal the word felt to those listening. Purity was a prayer they wore against their skin, even when it bled. Some believed that filth itself protected them, that washing too often might invite illness by opening the pores. The irony was cruel, but common dirt meant safety, and soap was seen as a dangerous luxury. The line between cleanliness and survival blurred until neither mattered. What endured was the cloth coarse, unchanged, and endlessly worn. The lives of these women were shaped by repetition, and their garments reflected it. Day after day, they performed the same rituals with the same materials, as if time itself refused to move forward. The rough linen did not simply touch the body, it became part of its story. Every stain, every tear, every hardened crease was a record of hunger, labour, and endurance. The underwear they wore was not just clothing, it was a quiet confession of poverty that touched their bodies every moment of their lives. It kept them decent, but never truly clean. In its roughness lived the mark of their class, one that no amount of washing could remove. The harsh cloth that clung to them told more about their world than words ever could. It spoke of scarcity, silence, and the quiet strength of those who had no choice but to endure. Somewhere beyond those cottages, another form of discomfort waited, one not hidden beneath the fabric but tangled in their hair. And what rested on their heads would reveal another layer of neglect that time refused to wash away. Hair was rarely washed, not because women did not care for it, but because the act itself demanded more effort than the body could spare. Every bucket of water had to be carried from the well or stream, heavy and sloshing, sometimes for half a mile, and that water was precious. It was needed for drinking, cooking, and cleaning tools long before anyone thought of hair. In small cottages, the idea of washing one's head for comfort sounded indulgent. So, the hair remained untouched for weeks, slick with oil, dust, and smoke from the hearth. Combs were shared, their teeth clogged with strands of other women's hair, and lice crawled openly through the roots. To manage the filth, women twisted their hair into tight knots at the back of the head, hiding the shine of grease beneath layers of tangled strands. The braid was a disguise, a way to look neat without being clean. Once it was bound, it might stay that way for months. The hair hardened into a single mass that moved as one piece, stiff with dirt. It was almost funny how a braid could pass for tidiness when it was really a rope of grime. When the knots grew too thick to undo, they were cut away, leaving uneven patches. No one minded, for in the villages, beauty had little meaning compared to labour. A woman's hands mattered more than her reflection, and hair, once admired, became simply another task too heavy to bear. Fat from cooked meat often finds a second purpose. When the broth cooled, the layer of grease that floated on top was scraped into a small jar. Women rubbed this onto their hair, believing it kept it soft and moist. The result was the opposite. The grease-trapped smoke, dust, and the scent of sweat. It clung to the scalp and turned rancid in the heat, drawing insects that fed near the roots. Yet the sheen it created was mistaken for health. If this happened today, it would be like using cooking oil as shampoo and calling it beauty care. The air inside the cottages was heavy with the smell, a mixture of oil, earth, and animals, all bound into the strands of every woman who lived there. When night came, they did not loosen their braids. The knots were tight enough to hold through sleep, and to unbind them meant inviting the lice to move freely. They hitched in silence, scratching discreetly while stirring porridge or carrying firewood. In gatherings, women might pick at each other's scalps, searching for lice and crushing them between fingernails. It was a gesture of care, an intimacy that bound the poor together. The parasites were part of life, no more shocking than the calluses on their feet. There was something strangely tender about a world that accepted filth as a sign of belonging. The mirrors, when they existed, were small and darkened by age. No one lingered before them. The reflection that stared back was only a reminder of exhaustion. Hair that once might have glowed under sunlight now lay dulled and heavy, smelling of smoke. The woman no longer remembered its colour. They tied it up, covered it with a scarf, and went back to work. Children learned early that hair was not a thing to be admired. Mothers told them to keep it tied, to keep it still, to keep it hidden. Clean hair belonged to paintings of saints, not to those who dug in fields. Season after season, their scalps suffered. In winter, the cold turned the grease stiff, cracking the skin beneath it. In summer, heat and sweat turned the mixture into a film that glued the roots together. Washing might have helped, but washing meant waste. A bucket of water could mean a meal or a clean shirt, and both mattered more than hair. To wash was to appear idle, and idleness was a sin against survival. The smell of old grease lingered in the air, absorbed by clothes, walls, and skin. When a breeze passed through, it carried the scent of life lived too close to labour. The belief that hair should not be washed often came with superstition. Some thought that water could weaken the head, letting in sickness through the scalp. Others said wetting the hair might bring misfortune, a chill that could spread to the bones. These fears, mixed with necessity, turned neglect into custom. In many ways, their habits were born not of ignorance but of fatigue. When every day demanded the body's full effort, hygiene became a luxury. There was, however, a peculiar pride in endurance. Women boasted quietly of how long they could go without washing. Their strength was measured not only in the weight of buckets carried or soil turned, but in their ability to endure discomfort without complaint. They spoke of hair that had survived winters without a single wash, as if resilience itself lived in the knots. The scalp burned, the hair stiffened, and still they tied it higher, as though dignity could be woven from dirt. The smell of their heads filled the narrow lanes of the villages, mingling with the odour of manure, smoke, and wet straw. It was not pleasant, but it was familiar. Even when lice spread from house to house, few took notice. No one was free of them, not even the children. To scratch was to live, and to live was to accept. The oil, the sweat, and the dirt became part of who they were, an invisible crown of poverty worn without protest. Their unwashed hair told silent stories of exhaustion and routine. It was both shield and burden, a reflection of lives bound by necessity. They carried the smell of their labour in every strand, and it followed them like a shadow. The braid was a symbol not of carelessness but of survival. The hair that clung to their scalps mirrored the weight of their daily struggle. It was proof of what they endured and what they could no longer change. From the head downward, their bodies bore the marks of labour, but some burdens left no visible trace. Beneath the layers of cloth, another kind of discomfort waited, hidden from view yet impossible to escape. Cleanliness, for peasant women, was an act of improvisation more than intention. Without cloth, soap, or privacy, they relied on what the fields and hearth provided. Dry grass, gathered from the edge of the road or near the stables, became their substitute for soft fabric. It was brittle, uneven, and rough to the touch, but it was all they had. In the quiet corners of their cottages, they used handfuls of this grass to wipe away what the body shed, careful only that no one was watching. The stalks scratched the skin and left small cuts that burned for days. Still, it was better than nothing. Tro, the fine ash from burned wood, was another tool. They called it clean because it came from fire. Mixed with moisture, it clung to the skin like dust, leaving a grey film that seemed to promise purification. For women who worked from dawn until the lamps were lit, there was no time for gentleness. The labour hardened their hands, and those same hands treated their bodies as though they were just another surface to be scrubbed. Ash felt like a gift from the hearth, something free and familiar. They did not know it carried tiny fragments of unburned wood that sliced the skin. They rubbed until the stinging faded into numbness, mistaking pain for cleanliness. It is grimly funny that the same ashes used to heat their food also became their only form of hygiene. When mixed with sweat, the residue turned to paste, collecting in creases where the skin was already sore. The next day, the same cycle began again. The smell that clung to them was unlike anything one could wash away. It was part smoke, part urine, and part the damp odour of unventilated rooms. Over time, the scent no longer registered. It followed them into the fields and to church, and even the priests became used to it. Clean was not a matter of scent or softness. It was an illusion built on habit. What mattered was that something had been done, that effort had been made, however small. If someone today were forced to live like this, they might call it cruelty disguised as routine. Yet for these women, survival left no room for revulsion. Their skin healed as best it could, scarred and hardened, like leather aged by years of work. When one woman shared her method with another, it was passed like a recipe, practical and unquestioned. They believed ash could purify, that the same substance used to wash cooking pots could remove what should not remain on their bodies. Grass was abundant, and ash endless, both available without cost. Even the poorest households had them. This was what made the practice endure its simplicity and its silence. There were no complaints, no better options, only the repetition of gestures learned from mothers who had done the same before them. The field gave them grain, the fire gave them warmth, and both gave them the illusion of being clean. The idea of infection did not exist for them. When the skin became red or swollen, they attributed it to heat or fate. The burning, the itching, the sores, all were accepted as parts of womanhood. Some women pressed cool clay against the skin to ease the pain, only to make it worse. Others sprinkled more ash, convinced that cleanliness could only be achieved through more abrasion. What they called purification was slow injury. It was a ritual that punished the body but comforted the mind. In some households, daughters helped their mothers prepare the ash, sifting it through fabric to remove large pieces. The fine dust looked soft and harmless, almost beautiful in the candlelight. It rested in a small bowl near the fire, waiting to be used. There was no sense of shame or secrecy. It was a routine task, no different from baking bread or milking goats. The same hands that kneaded dough would later scoop the ash, the same nails packed with soil from the fields. The boundary between cleanliness and dirt disappeared entirely. The mixture of ash and sweat created a peculiar coating that clung for days. When they worked under the sun, the heat reactivated the smell, a sour mix of smoke and human salt. In the evenings, when families gathered close to the hearth, the air was thick with it. No one noticed because everyone smelled the same. Even newborns, cradled in their mother's arms, inhaled that same air, growing up with it as the natural scent of home. To the poor, this was not filth, it was familiarity. The peasant women did not see themselves as unclean. They saw themselves as practical. The world offered no alternatives, so they made do. What they lacked in comfort, they made up for in resilience. Their bodies adapted to what they endured, and their minds found peace in repetition. To be clean was not to be free of dirt, but to survive despite it. Something is haunting about how easily the human body learns to accept pain when it has no other choice. The women were not careless. They were simply trapped within limits too narrow to escape. Their method left marks that did not fade. Over the years, the skin darkened, roughened, and thickened, forming a permanent reminder of what they had used. The ash stripped away oils that should have protected them, leaving the body vulnerable to cold and infection. But these consequences unfolded slowly, quietly, without spectacle. By the time illness took hold, no one remembered when it began. Cleanliness, for them, was always temporary, an illusion born of habit and necessity. In the stillness of those nights, the scent of smoke mixed with the whisper of dry grass formed the background of their existence. Their cleanliness was an act of faith, a belief that something so simple could keep them whole. It never did, but it gave them comfort enough to continue. The ash they trusted did not only scar their bodies, it marked their days, defining what it meant to be decent in a world without softness. It was their version of purity, rough and unyielding. Beyond the hearth, another test of the body awaited, one that came not from the ash, but from the open fields where necessity replaced modesty. And in that place, the concept of hygiene vanished entirely beneath the sky. The fields were not only a place of work, but also a place where modesty dissolved into necessity. For peasant women, the soil they ploughed, planted, and harvested upon was the same soil that received the body's waste. There were no boundaries between labour and relief, between cleanliness and contamination. When the need arose, a woman simply walked to the edge of the field, away from the men, but not too far from the tools she would soon return to. She lifted her skirts, crouched low, and let nature take its course. There were no walls, no privacy, only the open wind and the quiet rustle of crops. What was left behind mixed quickly with the earth, vanishing into the same ground that fed their crops. No one spoke of it, yet everyone did it. The act was as common as breathing, and no one thought to call it unclean. Water was scarce, and what little they carried from wells or rivers was saved for drinking or cooking. To waste it on washing after relieving oneself seemed absurd. A handful of dirt was sometimes used to scrub the hands, but this did little more than move the filth around. The fingers that touched the soil would soon touch bread, tools, or children. It is grimly amusing how they could separate the idea of purity from the act of cleanliness itself. The logic was simple: if they could not see the dirt, then it was gone. What lingered unseen was ignored. The same hands that buried seeds also stirred soup, stitched clothing, and wiped the faces of crying infants. Life went on as it always had. The body's functions were not treated with disgust, but with indifference. For women who worked from sunrise until dark, the body was a tool, and what it produced, sweat, blood, or waste, was simply part of its operation. There were no separate spaces for rest or hygiene, only the endless rhythm of work and exhaustion. They squatted between furrows, sometimes with children nearby, and rose to continue hoeing the soil as though nothing had happened. If such habits existed today, Entire towns would be declared unfit for living. Yet for them, it was normal, inevitable, and deeply practical. The earth absorbed everything, and the cycle continued without interruption. The lack of washing was not only about water, but also about belief. Many thought that cleaning oneself after such acts was unnecessary, even risky. Some said water could make the body cold, or that washing afterward invited illness into the womb. They believed that the body knew how to balance itself, that nature would take care of what they ignored, and so the custom persisted across generations, unquestioned and unexamined. Women passed it to their daughters as naturally as they passed on recipes for bread or the rhythm of planting. Cleanliness was not a moral lesson, but a luxury reserved for those who could afford soap and time. At home, the consequences of this neglect spread quietly. The same hands that had touched the ground prepared meals, shaped dough, and fed the family. No one noticed when a child fell ill or when the household suffered frequent fevers. Disease was common everywhere, and no one connected it to hygiene. The invisible dangers of bacteria and infection were centuries away from being understood. To them, sickness was divine will, not the result of dirty fingers. Something is unsettling about how ignorance can feel so peaceful when everyone shares it. The smell of the fields never left their skin. It clung to clothes, to hair, to the very air of their homes. The line between the human and the earth blurred completely. When it rained, the ground turned soft and sticky, and the waste buried within it rose back to the surface, mixing with the mud that coated their feet and hems. The filth was cyclical, returning to them no matter how far they walked. But there was no disgust, only acceptance. To live close to the soil was to live close to everything that came from it, including their own bodies. For many women, the act of relieving themselves was also a brief rest, a moment away from the constant weight of work. It was one of the few times they were alone, surrounded by silence instead of commands or crying. They did not rush. They watched the wind move through the crops, heard the distant sounds of animals, and then returned to the day's labour. Even in this, their solitude was fleeting. Privacy was not a concept for peasants. Every act was visible, every motion part of survival. Children learned by imitation. They followed their mothers to the fields and did as they did, squatting where the ground was dry. The habit formed early, so early that by adulthood, no one questioned it. Generations grew up thinking the earth itself was cleaner than water, that soil could absorb sin and sickness alike. When a traveller from town might pass by and wrinkle his nose, they saw it as arrogance. The poor did not have the luxury of disgust. What mattered was endurance, not appearance. In the evenings, when work ended and families gathered to eat, the traces of the day remained invisible but ever present. Dirt lodged beneath fingernails, dried along knuckles, and left faint streaks on bread. The scent of the fields hung over the meal, blending with the smoke from the fire. They ate in silence, unaware that every bite carried what the earth had given back. The body adapted, the stomach hardened, the people survived. To them, survival was proof enough of cleanliness. Women bore the hidden cost. Infections took root quietly, especially after childbirth, when the body was most fragile. But illness was simply another form of fatigue, one more ache in a life full of them. The discomfort faded into routine. They did not know that their simplest acts of living kept them in constant contact with danger. There was no shame in it, no sense of wrongdoing, only an unspoken agreement that life could not be lived any other way. It is a bitter kind of respect one feels for people who learn to exist so close to decay without complaint. Their resilience came not from ignorance alone, but from a deep understanding that the world offered no alternatives. Cleanliness, comfort, and safety were dreams for others, distant and unreachable. For the peasants, the earth gave everything and took everything back in turn. The field that sustained them also consumed their waste, their sweat, and their pain. It was their workplace, their refuge, and their latrine all at once. The soil beneath their feet held every secret of their survival, a silent record of what they could not change. The ground they depended on carried both their labour and their filth. It was the mirror of their lives, productive yet impure. What their hands touched in the soil, they would later wear on their skin and feed to their families. Beyond those fields, another danger waited, not in the earth, but in the water they shared with their animals, and what they thought could cleanse them would only make them dirtier still. Bathing, for peasant women, was never a private act of comfort, but a brief, shared ritual of necessity. The ponds and shallow streams scattered across the countryside served every purpose imaginable. They were watering holes for cattle, washing spots for clothes, and sometimes, on rare days, the only place where a body might meet water. When women approached these murky pools, they did so quietly, stepping past the muddy prints of hooves and paws. The surface of the water reflected not the sky but the film of dirt, grass, and animal waste that floated upon it. Yet to them it was clean enough. They undressed only as much as decency allowed, keeping their shift clutched high, lowering themselves into the water from the waist down. Above the chest, they stayed dry, protecting what they called the warmth, believing that wetting the upper body might invite fever or weakness. The act was not meant to refresh, but to rinse away the most visible dirt. Their arms brushed against the hides of animals that had come to drink, and the water rippled with every movement of life around them. Ducks floated near, cattle waded close, and dogs shook themselves dry at the shore. It was a scene of coexistence born not from choice but from the economy of survival. It almost seems absurd that the same pool could serve both for bathing and for beasts. Yet no one saw it as wrong. They cupped their hands, poured the cloudy water over their legs, and rubbed until the mud loosened, knowing well that they were never truly clean. When they stood, the drops that clung to their skin smelled faintly of manure and algae, but that was simply the scent of the world they lived in. Soap was unknown to most. Sometimes a bit of ash was rubbed between the palms, or sand from the stream bed was used to scrape the skin. The friction left scratches, and the water offered little comfort. It was often cold, even in summer, carrying the chill of the earth. After bathing, they did not wait to dry. Towels were rare, and wind only invited sickness. Instead, they dressed while still wet, pulling coarse linen back over damp flesh. The fabric stuck to their skin, trapping the moisture, and within minutes, the smell returned. If people today could smell that mix of wet cloth, smoke, and livestock, they would never call it bathing at all. But for peasant women, it was enough. The body was no longer covered in visible mud, and that counted as clean. In winter, bathing became nearly impossible. Ice formed over ponds, and water drawn from wells was painfully cold. Weeks passed without washing, and the body adjusted. When the thaw came, women bathed as if performing a duty, not a pleasure. They went in groups, not for company but for safety. The countryside was open, and being alone near water meant vulnerability. Their laughter carried across the fields, though it held no joy, only the brief relief of coolness and shared fatigue. The same water that touched their skin flowed into the buckets used for animals, into the troughs where pigs were fed, into the pots where laundry was rinsed. No one thought of separating these tasks. Purity was a concept reserved for the wealthy, who could afford wells deep enough to draw clean water. For the peasants, the pond was the centre of life. It gave them what they needed, no matter how murky, no matter how shared. The water never looked pure, but it was theirs. After bathing, they often carried that same water home in jugs, using it for cleaning floors or mixing dough. The contamination spread quietly, unseen, yet familiar. Families lived with stomach sicknesses and skin rashes without questioning why. Illness was part of existence, like rain or hunger. What mattered was getting through each day. not tracing the cause of discomfort. They washed because it was expected, not because it worked. The dirt on their bodies was traded for the dirt in the water, a balance they accepted. When they sat near the fire afterward, the damp linen released a faint steam. The smell of the pond lingered, mingling with smoke and sweat. Children pressed close to their mothers for warmth, unbothered by the scent, because everyone smelled the same. Cleanliness was not about fragrance or freshness. It was about effort, the visible attempt to maintain dignity in a world that left no room for luxury. There is something painfully admirable about how people could mistake endurance for purity. They did not seek comfort or perfection, only survival. Women told each other that washing only from the chest down protected their strength. The heart and lungs, they believed, must remain warm, sealed beneath fabric even during bathing. The body below the ribs could be scrubbed, but the rest must stay untouched. This belief gave them an excuse to do less, to protect themselves from the cold and exhaustion. The result was uneven cleanliness, patches of washed skin beside areas left untouched for months. But no one questioned it. The same method was passed from mother to daughter as naturally as planting grain. By late summer, when ponds dried and water turned green with algae, they bathed anyway. The surface smelled foul, the mud below soft and thick. When they stepped in, their feet sank deep and bubbles of gas rose from beneath. The sensation made them laugh sometimes, though it was laughter without happiness. They splashed, rubbed, and hurried out before the sun set, leaving ripples that slowly stilled behind them, their footprints in the mud dried by morning, as though no one had been there at all. The women who shared the pond also shared its sickness. Eye infections, rashes, and fevers were common, but no one could prove the cause. There were no doctors to ask, no cures to try. When someone fell ill, it was called fate, not filth. The cycle continued, year after year, unchanged. The pond that reflected the sky also held the memory of everybody who had entered it, of every life that depended on its water. The shared water that once felt like relief carried more than dirt. It carried the quiet proof of their poverty. It touched every life in the village, binding people and animals in the same fragile balance between need and decay. What cleansed them also tainted them, leaving behind a scent of survival that never washed away. Beyond the ponds and streams, another kind of cleansing awaited, one done not by water, but by the harsh sun. And it would leave the body marked in ways that no one could see, but everyone could smell. Undergarments for peasant women were stitched together not from comfort, but from whatever scraps the world left behind. In homes where new fabric was an impossible dream, the rough burlap of grain sacks became the most practical solution. Once emptied of barley or wheat, these coarse bags were cut open and flattened on the table. The women trimmed them with dull scissors, trying to create a shape that resembled a garment, though the result was closer to armour than clothing. The fabric was stiff, heavy, and smelled faintly of grain and mould. When worn against bare skin, it scratched constantly, leaving red patches that turned raw with sweat. But this was not considered a hardship. It was simply how things were. The sleeves were uneven, the hems jagged, and the stitching thick enough to leave impressions on the body after a long day. These makeshift undershirts were worn until the fibres began to fray. There was no thought of fashion or modesty, only function. Women needed something between their skin and the layers of outer clothing, something to soak up the sweat while they worked. The burlap did that well enough. When it grew too stiff to bend or too dirty to bear, it was not washed but hung in the sun, as if light itself could remove the smell. It is darkly humorous how sunlight was treated as a kind of soap for those who had never known the luxury of one. The heat hardened the fabric instead of softening it. Each fold became sharper, like paper soaked and dried too many times. When they put it back on, it chafed against the body anew. Over months, the cloth absorbed everything: sweat, oil, dust, even the faint smoke from the hearth. Its original colour vanished, replaced by a deep yellow-brown that spoke of use and endurance. If someone today saw such a garment, they might mistake it for a rag meant to scrub floors, not something meant to touch skin. Yet for the women who wore it, it was an indispensable layer, a shield against both cold and shame. To make one requires patience and necessity, not skill. Mothers taught daughters how to cut along the seams of old sacks, how to shape armholes, and how to patch the holes that formed near the chest or shoulders. Every stitch told of scarcity. The thread used was often made from unravelling older garments, twisted together until strong enough to hold. Buttons were rare. Knots of twine or thin strips of leather served in their place. When a shirt tore, it was repaired again and again until it was more patch than fabric. The smell of burlap never disappeared, even after years. It clung to the skin like another scent of life, mixing with the odour of sweat and hay. During the harvest season, when work stretched from dawn to darkness, sweat soaked through every layer. The rough undershirt trapped moisture close to the body, refusing to dry. The dampness led to rashes, sometimes to open sores beneath the arms and along the waist. Still, the women said nothing. Pain had long since lost its meaning. They believed that washing the shirt would only weaken it, that the fibres would dissolve in water and leave them with nothing to wear. There is something both tragic and admirable in how they valued endurance over comfort, as though suffering itself made them whole. At night, the undershirt was rarely removed. It was easier to sleep in it, to let it serve as both garment and blanket. The cottage air was cool, and straw mattresses offered little warmth. The same fabric that burned the skin by day became protection by night. When morning came, the smell of dried sweat and smoke lingered in the room. It was heavy, sour, but familiar. They no longer noticed it. Smell, like pain, was something they had learned to ignore. The texture of burlap left marks that lasted even after the shirt was gone. The skin became calloused in strange places, thickened where the fabric rubbed most. In some areas, it peeled or darkened, leaving stains that no water could remove. The body adapted to the roughness, and over time, the sensation of irritation turned into numbness. It was a small mercy offered by exhaustion. Cleanliness, softness, comfort. These were words that belonged to other lives, not theirs. The idea of washing the undershirt was almost laughable. There was no soap, and to waste water on such a thing seemed foolish. When the stench became unbearable, they hung it outside for a day or two, letting the wind carry away what it could. They called it freshening. The truth was that the sun only baked the sweat deeper into the cloth. Flies sometimes landed on it, drawn by the faint sweetness of decay. Yet when it came time to wear it again, they did so without hesitation. Habit was stronger than disgust. The burlap undershirt represented more than clothing. It was a boundary between decency and exposure. To wear it was to maintain a fragile sense of dignity, even if it hurt to touch. The women who wore these garments never thought of themselves as pitiful. They took quiet pride in their ability to endure. They could patch, mend, and make do with almost nothing. Every tear resown was proof of survival. The shirt might be rough, but it was theirs, and that mattered more than its discomfort. In the dim light of their cottages, the undershirts hung from pegs near the hearth, waiting for another day's use. The air around them was filled with the smell of smoke and salt, a scent that marked both labour and life. The fabric no longer belonged to the world of things that could be cleaned or replaced. It had crossed into the realm of permanence, as much a part of the women as the calluses on their hands. The coarse shirts that clung to their bodies were symbols of endurance disguised as garments. Each thread held the story of scarcity, each stain a trace of survival. Their purpose was never to comfort, only to shield. Beyond these layers of fabric, another ritual of false cleansing awaited, one where stone and skin met, and cleanliness came through pain rather than relief. Bathing without soap turned the act of cleaning into something closer to punishment. For peasant women, smoothness was not achieved through comfort but through abrasion. Along the banks of streams, they picked up small stones that fit in the palm, testing their edges against the skin to see if they were dull enough to scrape but not slice. These stones became their tools of hygiene. When no stone was near, they used what nature offered, dried husks of luffa gourds or rough bark from nearby trees. Once chosen, these makeshift scrubbers were kept and used until they fell apart, sometimes lasting years. They were stored near the fire, beside cooking utensils and tools for mending clothes, their presence unremarkable but essential. Each washing was an act of effort. The women crouched by the river or stood beside a basin, rubbing their arms and legs until the skin turned red. The rough surfaces tore at old layers, leaving behind new scratches that stung when sweat touched them. There was no soap to soften the process, no oil to soothe afterward, only water, cold, muddy, and full of grit, served as their companion. They believed that if the skin burned after washing, it meant the dirt was gone. It is bitterly ironic how pain became their measure of cleanliness. The harsh strokes of stone replaced the softness of cloth, and blood mingled quietly with the water. The stones and bark carried their own filth. They were used by multiple people, sometimes shared between mothers and daughters, between friends at the stream. Over time, they collected oils, dead skin, and fragments of dirt that never fully washed away. Yet the women continued using them, convinced that boiling or replacing them would be wasteful. If such tools were sold in a store today, no one would buy them except perhaps as curiosities of suffering. But for these women, they were as ordinary as a comb or a cooking pot. The sensation of rubbing stone on skin became familiar, almost ritualistic. It was done in silence, with focus. The scraping sound echoed softly through cottages when women washed at home, crouched beside buckets or clay basins. The rhythmic motion matched the pace of their lives, steady, unending, without relief. The effort left them exhausted, yet somehow satisfied. Their skin felt raw but clean, and for a brief moment they believed themselves renewed. The redness faded by morning, replaced by new layers of hardened skin that could better withstand the next washing. The old loofah sponges, when they began to crumble, were not discarded. They were dried again in the sun and pressed back into use, until only threads remained. Bark was smoothed down until it was as thin as parchment. Stones became polished by repetition, their edges worn from years of scraping human flesh. There was a strange intimacy between the women and their tools, a quiet bond formed through shared endurance. They cared for them the way others might care for jewellery, because in a sense they too marked beauty, just not the kind one could see. Cleanliness was not about appearance, but about ritual, even if the skin remained stained or the scent of sweat lingered. The act itself was enough. It was proof that they had done their part, that they had not given in to decay. Dirt was their constant enemy, one that could never be defeated but only kept at bay. They fought it with what little they had, scraping until the skin itself became another kind of armour. Something is haunting in how easily necessity can twist care into harm. The tools meant to purify became instruments of quiet destruction, yet they persisted in using them, certain that endurance equalled virtue. After years of this, their skin grew thick and uneven. Patches of darkened flesh appeared on their elbows, knees, and arms where the stones had passed most often. Some women developed scars that looked like old burns. Others lost sensitivity altogether, their skin too tough to feel anything but pressure. They believed this hardness was strength. The more their bodies adapted, the less they bled, and that, to them, meant progress. The cycle continued, each washing reinforcing what hardship had already carved into them. Sometimes, when the river ran low or frozen, they used handfuls of sand instead. The grains clung to the skin, grinding into pores, leaving scratches invisible to the eye but painful to the touch. The feeling of grit between fingers and flesh was a constant reminder that life for them was always abrasive. Nothing was soft, not the ground beneath their feet, not the hands that fed them, not the methods that kept them alive. In the rare moments when they caught sight of themselves in still water, they saw a reflection shaped by work and weather, faces lined too early, hands rough as bark, and arms marked by years of self-inflicted scraping. They did not see ugliness. They saw survival. Cleanliness, in their eyes, was not a matter of beauty but of discipline. To wash was to prove control over the body, even if it came through pain. It was an act that said, "I am still here," even when comfort was gone. The old stones and loofah fragments, darkened by years of use, sat near the hearth, reminders of the countless hours spent maintaining the illusion of cleanliness. They were relics of endurance, worn smooth by both the body and time. When they finally broke apart, another would take their place, found in the same river, cut from the same gourd, used the same way. Nothing changed, because nothing could. The ritual of scrubbing, repeated endlessly, revealed how deeply necessity governed every part of their lives. It was a battle they never won but never stopped fighting. Beneath the hardened surface of their skin, there was a quiet ache that no one saw, the cost of appearing clean in a world that gave them nothing pure. The tools they trusted to wash away dirt only embedded it deeper, leaving invisible traces that would never fade. Beyond their aching skin waited another burden, the hidden cycle that returned each month. When blood met poverty and hygiene became an even greater struggle than before. Menstruation for peasant women was not a matter of care but of endurance. No clean linens were waiting, no soft cloth stored away for the days when their bodies bled. Instead, they reached for what was available: old rags, torn from clothing too worn to mend, or handfuls of dry straw wrapped inside fabric. The material was stiff, uneven, and often left splinters or fibres against the skin. They folded these makeshift pads awkwardly, securing them with strings or simply pressing them between layers of clothing. The goal was not comfort, only containment. Each step reminded them of the roughness beneath, yet there was no other choice. The rags were reused until they fell apart. When soaked through, they were rinsed quickly in cold water, never washed with soap, and hung in hidden corners of the cottage. The women feared that leaving them in the sun might bring shame, so they dried them near the hearth, where the smoke masked both smell and evidence. The heat stiffened the cloth, making it harsh against the body, but that did not matter. These were private things, meant to be unseen, and if they caused pain, it was pain endured in silence. It is disturbingly ironic that the act meant to preserve decency left them feeling filthier than before. The smell lingered, clinging to their skirts and bedding. It mixed with the scent of sweat, earth, and smoke, blending into the constant odour of survival. In the small rooms they shared with their families, there was no place for privacy or rest. They worked as usual, bent over fields or kneading dough, pretending that the ache between their legs was just another part of the day. Some shifted awkwardly when sitting, trying to ignore the dampness spreading through the layers of cloth. Others scratched discreetly, their hands rough and calloused from labour, only worsening the irritation. There were no words for discomfort. Pain was not something to discuss, especially not the pain tied to womanhood. Mothers taught daughters the same method without explanation, only showing them how to fold rags, how to hide them, and how to keep quiet. When infection came, it was accepted as fate. If someone today tried to live this way, they would call it barbaric. Yet for these women, it was tradition. The burning, the itching, the soreness, they were all part of the rhythm of life. No one expected it to be different. In winter, when water froze and washing became harder, the same clothes were used for weeks. Some women burned them afterward, believing that the blood carried weakness or bad luck, while others kept them until they simply disintegrated. The straw used inside the clothes turned dark and brittle, sometimes breaking apart and cutting the skin. When this happened, they replaced it with more straw, gathered hastily from the floor of the barn. There was no sense of disgust, only resignation. The smell of iron mixed with smoke clung to their bodies like a shadow. During harvest or heavy work, the bleeding went unnoticed until it stained their clothes. They tied their aprons tighter and kept going, aware that no one would care or comment. Blood was part of the earth. It fell, it dried, it disappeared. In a world ruled by dirt and labour, nothing stayed clean long enough to matter. The fabric they used was never truly clean again. Even after rinsing, faint stains remained, dull brown reminders of every month before. The texture grew rougher, the smell sharper. Some women sprinkled ash or rubbed the cloths with salt, believing it would remove the odour, but it only wore the fibres thinner. When the cloth tore, it was patched with another piece, mismatched and stiff. The patchwork grew thicker with each cycle, until the material became too heavy to wear. Only then would it be replaced with another old rag, and the cycle began anew. There was no comfort in rest. The constant friction led to wounds that festered quietly, but with no doctors and no remedies. They healed as best they could. The women carried on, their endurance mistaken for strength. They learned to move carefully, to press their knees together while walking, to hide stains beneath layers of fabric. Shame was stronger than pain, and silence was easier than change. There is something deeply sad about how suffering becomes invisible when it is shared by everyone. The air inside their cottages always carried traces of blood, smoke, and sweat. The smell was familiar, almost comforting. It meant life continued as usual. The men did not ask, the women did not explain, and the children learned by watching. Hygiene was not about health, it was about decency, about hiding what the body did naturally. The less seen, the better. The less said, the safer. When they went to church, they sat quietly in the back, wary of movement. They prayed not for comfort but for endurance. The wooden benches pressed against their sores, but they remained still, their faces calm and composed. To appear unbothered was its own form of dignity. In their silence, there was pride, the pride of women who bore every hardship without complaint, who carried the unclean parts of life with grace that no one noticed. When the bleeding ended, they rinsed the cloths one last time, hung them behind the stove, and returned to daily life. The soreness faded, the stains deepened, and the memory of discomfort blurred until the next month arrived. Nothing changed, nothing improved, and nothing was expected to. The rags and straw they trusted were proof of how poverty shaped even the most private parts of existence. Each cycle was a quiet endurance, a pattern of pain repeated across generations. What they called cleanliness was only survival disguised as modesty. The false sense of purity they clung to would soon extend beyond the body itself, reaching even the mouth, where the pursuit of freshness led to something far more bitter than decay. For peasant women, caring for their teeth was not a matter of beauty but a fight against rot. Fought with what little they had, toothbrushes, as the wealthy knew them, did not exist in their world. Instead, they chewed the ends of small twigs until the fibres split apart into stiff bristles. These makeshift brushes were dry, uneven, and splintered easily, often cutting the gums and leaving tiny wooden fragments behind. They used them without hesitation, scraping across the surface of their teeth until blood mixed faintly with the taste of ash. There was no gentleness, no rhythm of self-care, only the instinct to scrub away what felt unclean. Ash was their most common cleaning powder. Gathered from the hearth, it was sifted through cloth to remove large pieces, though tiny bits of charcoal always remained. Some women mixed it with coarse salt to give a sharper edge, believing the sting meant it was working. The sensation burned, but it was the only sign of cleanliness they understood. The gritty mixture ground against enamel, leaving a faint squeak that they mistook for purity. It is almost darkly funny that the same ashes used to cook their food were the ones they used to scour their mouths. The act was not daily, nor even weekly, only when the taste of sourness became too strong to ignore. The smell of their breath was thick and fermented, born from poor diet, bad water, and unwashed teeth. Yet no one noticed. In their world, everyone smelled the same, and so no one stood out, talking closely, laughing, or shouting in the fields. Their words carried the scent of decay, but it was the scent of normal life. No one covered their mouths. No one felt shame. If someone today met them face to face, the odour alone would make them recoil. Yet these women carried it with the same calm they carried every other burden. The mouth, after all, was only another part of the body that had to endure. Their gums swelled from the constant scraping, bleeding whenever the twigs dug too deep. Over time, their teeth loosened, shifting out of place. When pain came, they endured it quietly, pressing rags soaked in liquor or salt water against their jaws until it passed. No one thought to see a healer. Losing teeth was expected, as natural as growing grey hair. The idea of keeping one's teeth for life was as unrealistic as owning new shoes every year. What mattered was being able to eat, not how one looked while doing it. The ash left a dry bitterness that lingered for hours. It coated the tongue, leaving the mouth parched and rough. Some women chewed herbs afterward, not for freshness, but to mask the taste of soot. Mint and sage were rare, so they used whatever grew nearby grass, pine needles, or bark shavings. The sharpness of these plants sometimes numbed the gums, and they took that as proof of cleanliness. The irony was cruel. Every attempt to purify made their mouths weaker. Something is unsettling about how people can accept slow damage when it is disguised as care. The teeth darkened over time, not from neglect, but from the very methods used to clean them. Ash and salt stripped away enamel, leaving the surface porous and dull. The edges chipped easily, and cavities spread without warning. The pain was constant, but pain was already so common that it lost meaning. Women chewed on one side, learned to swallow without biting, and continued as before. Their smiles, when they appeared, were small and closed. Laughter came through lips, never showing what lay behind. When the ash ran out, they used soot scraped from the bottom of cooking pots. Its oily texture clung to the teeth, making them look darker for a while before washing away. It worked no better, but they believed in the ritual more than the result. To do nothing would be lazy, and laziness was worse than dirt. Cleanliness was not about success, but about effort, about proving that one still cared enough to try. The twigs they used were often saved and reused until they snapped. Some were tied together in small bundles to make them easier to grip. They rested beside the hearth, among tools for tending fires and stirring stews, blackened with use. Children learned from their mothers, biting into new twigs and mimicking the scraping motions. By the time they grew older, the habit was as natural as breathing. None of them questioned it, because it was what everyone had always done. Their mouths were small landscapes of survival, cracked lips, swollen gums, and teeth that bore the marks of ash and time. Yet they smiled through it all. Their lives were too full of labour to worry about what could not be changed. They accepted decay as they accepted hunger, cold, and pain. Theirs was not a beauty of whiteness or health, but of endurance. The blackened twigs and grey dust became symbols of resilience, tiny gestures of care in a world that offered no comfort. In the dim light of their cottages, after long days in the fields, they sat by the fire and pressed the ash-stained twigs to their teeth, scraping quietly while smoke curled upward. The sound was faint, rhythmic, almost like a prayer. When they finished, they spat into the fire and watched it hiss. To them, that sound meant something had been purified. They could go to sleep believing their bodies, however briefly, were clean again. The ashes that whitened their teeth only deepened the illusion of purity. Each scrape was a promise that could never be fulfilled. a ritual of effort performed without reward. Their mouths, once full of laughter and words, became another place where survival left its mark. From the teeth to the skin, every part of them bore the evidence of labour, and soon the fabric that covered those bodies would tell its own story of decay hidden beneath the guise of modesty. Dressing each day for a peasant woman was not an act of choice, but of survival. Their clothing was a shield against the cold, the mud, and the endless work that filled their hours. They wore layer upon layer of fabric, each one older and heavier than the last. The outer skirts protected against the dirt of the fields, while the inner ones were meant to keep the warmth close to the body. Together they formed a cocoon of fabric that rarely left their skin. Washing was out of the question. Water was scarce, and soap even more so. To undress completely would mean exposing oneself to the chill, and there was no time for such luxury. The dresses were worn until they broke apart at the seams, only to be replaced when patches could no longer hide the holes. Each layer absorbed the traces of life: sweat, smoke, soil, and sometimes blood soaked into the fibres until the cloth became part of the body itself. In winter, the moisture froze against the inner skirts, making them stiff and heavy. In summer, the heat turned them into damp shrouds that clung to the skin. Beneath these layers, air rarely touched the flesh. The smell that built up was sharp, sour, and ever-present, a mixture of labour and neglect. It almost feels absurd that they mistook weight and warmth for cleanliness, wrapping themselves tighter with every trace of filth. Yet for them, this was a necessity, not a choice. To wash was to waste, and waste was a sin against survival. The outer skirts bore stains from the fields, mud splatters, crushed grass, streaks of animal waste, all ground into the fabric by months of work. The lower hems were always dark and stiff, sometimes standing on their own when removed. The inner skirts were worse, hidden from view but soaked with everything the body released. Menstrual blood dried in dark patterns that no washing could remove, and the mix of sweat and dirt formed a crust that rubbed against the skin until sores appeared. Still, the garment stayed. If someone today wore the same clothes for even a week, they would call it unbearable. Yet these women lived years without ever feeling clean. The process of dressing was slow and heavy. Each morning, they wrapped themselves again, lifting layers still damp from yesterday's sweat. They tied cords around their waist to hold the skirts in place, creating a tightness that made breathing shallow. The weight of the fabric pressed down, reshaping the body itself. Their backs curved from the burden, their shoulders thickened, their movements deliberate and restrained. The dresses aged with them, carrying their labour in every fold. Washing clothes was more than impractical. It was dangerous. Wet fabric took days to dry, and wearing it too soon invited chills that could lead to sickness. Instead, they hung their skirts near the fire, letting the smoke fill them. The smell of burning wood became their substitute for soap. To them, smoke cleansed everything. When the garments grew too foul to bear, they were left outside overnight, the wind doing what it could, but the odour never disappeared. It only blended with the scent of ash, becoming part of the woman herself. Each dress told the story of the seasons passing. The outermost fabric faded under the sun, while the inner layers darkened from the body's warmth. The colours that once marked their owners, brown, grey, dull blue, merged into the same lifeless hue of earth. The hems frayed, the seams pulled, and still they were mended. Old skirts became linings for new ones, stitches visible like scars across the surface. When one garment finally tore beyond repair, it was not thrown away but cut into strips, used as rags for cleaning or padding for shoes. Nothing was ever wasted, not even filth. Underneath, the skin suffered. Rashes spread where fabric rubbed raw against flesh. Lice found homes in the seams, and the constant dampness invited infection. Yet the women spoke of none of it. To complain was useless. Everyone lived the same way, and shared discomfort was no longer discomfort at all. They endured, wrapping themselves tighter, convinced that the layers protected them from sickness and shame. Modesty was not a virtue but a necessity. Without it, they were naked not just in body but in dignity. At night, they did not remove the skirts but loosened them enough to lie down. The weight pressed them into their straw beds, trapping warmth beneath the same fabric that carried the day's dirt. The smell of sweat and smoke filled the air, but in that scent, they found a strange comfort. It was the smell of their own survival, of effort made visible. Cleanliness, in their world, was not the absence of dirt but the endurance of it. There is something deeply human about how people learn to live with the unbearable until it feels like safety. The dresses aged alongside the women, stiff and misshapen. They became part of their silhouettes, extensions of lives defined by work. A peasant woman without her layers would feel exposed, not just to the cold but to the eyes of the world. The fabric gave her form, purpose, and weight. It was her armour, her shame, and her history all at once. Inside the folds of those skirts, whole years of labour were trapped, dust from harvest fields, flakes of dried blood, crumbs of bread, strands of hair, and the scent of countless days spent beneath the same sun. The garments that covered them did not protect them from filth. They preserved it. The longer they were worn, the more they became records of existence, each stain a testimony of work, hunger, and endurance. The skirts that clung to their bodies carried more than warmth. They carried the weight of everything unwashed and unspoken. They defined what it meant to be decent, even while decaying against the skin. Yet under those layers, life continued, and the same hands that adjusted their hems would soon return to the fire and prepare food with fingers that had never truly been clean. Cooking in a peasant home was not an act of pleasure but another form of labour, done with hands that never truly rested and never truly cleaned. The same fingers that dug in the soil, gathered manure, or plucked feathers from a chicken were the ones that kneaded dough and stirred porridge. There was no sense of separation between work and nourishment, between filth and food. Water was precious and used sparingly, often saved for drinking or feeding animals. Washing hands before cooking was not part of their world. To them, dirt was as natural as air. The skin of their hands was always darkened with soil, the lines of their palms filled with mud and ash, fingernails cracked and curled from constant labour, their edges blackened with what could never be scrubbed out. The smell of earth clung to everything. When they cooked, it blended into the scent of smoke and grain until no one could tell the difference. It is grimly amusing that what should have disgusted them became the very flavour of their daily meals. They did not see contamination, only continuation. Life itself came from the same soil that stained their skin. After cleaning stalls or spreading manure, they went straight to their cooking pots. The same calloused hands that grasped the neck of a chicken now tore apart bread or stirred boiling soup. Sometimes a bit of feather or straw floated in the broth, unnoticed. Sometimes the colour of the stew darkened not from herbs but from what clung beneath their nails. There was no disgust, no pause. The idea of hygiene as a separate act had no place in their lives. Everything they touched, animals, soil, tools, was part of one continuous rhythm of survival. If someone today looked into those kitchens, they would not believe how close rot and nourishment once lived together. The tools they used were few and worn. Wooden spoons grew dark with use, iron pots lined with soot, knives smeared with grease that never fully left. Cleaning meant scraping, wiping with the same cloth used for everything else. A rag hung near the hearth, stiff with old fat and ash, passed between hands for drying, cleaning, and wiping the face. That single piece of fabric carried more germs than the animals they cooked, yet no one questioned its place. The thought of invisible dangers did not exist. Only visible ones mattered. Fire, hunger, and cold were threats they could understand. Children grew up watching their mothers cook this way. They played on the floor beside the hearth, surrounded by chickens and dogs, picking crumbs from the same ground where ashes and manure had fallen. Illness was not traced to the kitchen, but to the weather, or to bad spirits, or simply bad luck. If a child fell sick, they boiled herbs, whispered prayers, and kept cooking as before. There was no sense of cause and effect, only of fate. When food spoiled, they ate it anyway, trusting the heat of the fire to kill what they could not see. The smell of cooking in a peasant house was heavy and layered smoke, damp wood, animal fat, and something faintly sour that never left. It filled the air, settled on clothes, and seeped into their skin. Meals were eaten quickly, often with fingers, everyone dipping from the same pot. Biting into bread meant tasting everything that had touched its sweat, ash, and the residue of life lived too close to the earth. Yet there was comfort in that closeness. To them, it was the smell of home, the proof of labour and warmth. In winter, when the water froze in the buckets, washing anything became impossible. They cooked with numb fingers still coated in dirt, their knuckles split and raw from the cold. The pain did not stop them. Hunger was stronger. Even when small infections turned to abscesses, the work continued. A wound might throb as they stirred the pot, but no one stopped to bandage it. The food was served, the hands wiped on an apron, and life went on. They knew that to pause for comfort was to fall behind in survival. There were moments when a sliver of reflection appeared, when a mother noticed the grime under her nails as she fed her child, but those thoughts faded quickly. Cleanliness was for those who could afford time, and time was the rarest possession of all. The peasants lived in a cycle where the same hands that fed them also spread disease, though they never knew it. The irony is cruel. Their devotion to sustaining life carried the seeds of sickness that slowly destroyed it. There is a quiet tragedy in watching care and contamination blend so seamlessly. At night, after the fire burned low, the pots were left unwashed, the remnants hardened into crust, becoming part of the next meal. The hands that had cooked rested briefly before returning to the same work at dawn. No soap, no water, no clean break between one day and another, just the endless motion of hands shaping, touching, and carrying the world's dirt. Those hands, cracked and darkened, were both creators and carriers of life. They fed families, birthed children, and buried the dead. They stitched clothes, lifted tools, and stirred boiling stew. Their filth was not a mark of neglect but of necessity, and in that necessity lay the story of their entire existence. The meals they made carried both warmth and danger, a mix of nourishment and decay served on the same wooden plates. The dirt under their nails was the same soil that grew their food, and in that circle they saw no sin. But as the layers of grime hardened, even their bodies became vessels of contamination, and what began with cooking would continue into every other act of care that touched the home. During the long winters, when the cold cracked their skin until it bled, peasant women turned to what they had, animal fat saved from the kitchen fires. After slaughtering pigs, they melted the fat down and poured it into clay jars, believing it to be a gift of warmth and healing. The jars sat near the hearth, their contents cooling into pale lumps that hardened with time. There was no perfume, no oil, no cream, only the scent of smoke and flesh. Each morning, they dipped their fingers into the jar and rubbed the fat over their faces and hands, spreading a layer of grease that shone under the dim light. It trapped the cold out and the smell in. The fat spoiled quickly, souring as the weeks passed. Its surface turned yellow and sticky, and a sharp odour filled the air whenever the lid was lifted. Yet no one threw it away. To waste even rancid fat was unthinkable. The same jar could last an entire winter, shared among the family. Mothers smeared it on their children's cheeks before sending them out into the frost, the smell following them like a second skin. It seems almost absurd that what they called protection was little more than decay spread across their faces. Still, to them, it worked. Their skin no longer cracked, and that was enough proof of success. At night, as they sat by the fire, the glistening patches of fat caught the flicker of the flames. The shine made their faces appear wet as though from sweat, but it was the gleam of rancid oil reflecting light. The heat from the hearth made it melt again, and droplets slid slowly down their cheeks, carrying the smell of rot and smoke. If someone today entered such a cottage, they might mistake it for the scent of tallow candles melting, never realizing it came from the women themselves. The odor was heavy, seeping into their clothes, their bedding, and the walls. Over time, even the air seemed to grow greasy. They stored the jars in cool corners when not in use, often near the same shelves that held food. Dust settled on the surface, and insects sometimes gathered at the rim. When the fat developed a film, it was scraped off and stirred back in, mixed again until smooth. This ritual was done without disgust. They had long since stopped separating the pleasant from the unpleasant. The line between the two had blurred into practicality. As long as something could serve a purpose, it was good enough. The fat was applied to more than faces and hands. It softened cracked heels, soothed raw elbows, and eased the burn of frostbite. Sometimes it was rubbed into the scalp to fight dryness, leaving the hair slick and dark. The skin glowed with a strange shine, neither healthy nor clean. Children grew up associating that smell with comfort. They leaned against their mother's greasy sleeves while listening to the fire, unaware that the warmth they felt came from decay. Something is haunting in how care, when twisted by poverty, can smell so close to death. When spring came, the leftover jars were emptied, the remaining fat thick and dark like wax. They washed the jars with water, though the smell never truly left. The next season, they filled them again, repeating the cycle. The fat that had once been food became medicine, then waste, then food for flies. Still, it remained a household necessity, even as it turned, even as it stank. They believed in its power to protect. The belief was stronger than the stench. Their faces, coated daily with the mixture, developed a peculiar texture over time. The pores clogged, and small boils appeared around the mouth and chin. Some women scratched them open with their nails, letting the pus dry beneath another layer of grease. They told themselves that these marks were signs of healing. No one imagined that the very thing meant to preserve their skin was slowly suffocating it. To question the practice would mean admitting ignorance, and that was harder than enduring discomfort. The matted fabric of their sleeves absorbed the fat as they rubbed it in. Over months, the cuffs stiffened, darkening with residue until they glowed faintly in the firelight. The same hands that prepared bread and wiped children's faces carried the same sheen, gloved in grease. When they touched anything, wood, fabric, or food, they left faint stains behind. The house itself bore their fingerprints, invisible marks of daily survival. At night, when they lay down to sleep, the scent of sour fat lingered close, mingling with the musty air of straw bedding and smoke. The smell became so familiar that they no longer noticed it, even as it turned the stomachs of visitors. It was their scent, the perfume of endurance. Beneath it lay the quiet truth that cleanliness, for them, had nothing to do with freshness or fragrance. It was about function, about preventing pain, about surviving another day without bleeding from the cold. The jars of fat that lined their shelves were more than ointment. They were symbols of poverty disguised as care. They embodied the resourcefulness that life demanded of them, the ability to transform scraps into comfort. But they also held a darker story, the slow erosion of the line between life and rot, between healing and harm. The women's skin gleamed beneath the firelight, slick with decay, and they believed themselves safe beneath its protection. What they could not see was that the same hands spreading that oily comfort would soon reach for the jars again, this time to clean not themselves but the few garments that still clung to their weary bodies. In the world of peasant women, the idea of cleansing was not tied to purity but to survival, and when soap was a luxury beyond imagination, they turned to the one thing they had in abundance, the soil beneath their feet. The fields where they toiled from dawn to dusk became their bathhouses, and the same mud that clung to their skirts was what they trusted most to keep them healthy. They believed the earth could draw out illness, that its weight and cold could pull away the bad air that made the body weak. When they returned from the fields, their arms sore and legs covered in dust, they crouched near the riverbank, scooping handfuls of thick brown mud and spreading it slowly over their skin. The coolness was soothing, a brief relief from the heat of labour. The smell was strong but familiar, the scent of life itself in their eyes. The mud dried slowly under the sun, tightening their skin until it cracked. They stood waiting, silent and patient, until it formed a brittle shell across their faces and arms. When it hardened enough, they scraped it off with bits of bark or dull blades, watching as the flakes fell to the ground. What remained was skin rubbed raw, red and stinging, but in their minds it meant they had shed sickness along with the dirt. It is strangely ironic that they thought of the soil as a cleanser when it was the very thing that carried disease back onto their bodies. Still, they repeated the ritual with devotion, convinced that pain was proof of purification. The mud came from ditches, ponds, or fields where livestock often grazed. It was mixed with the droppings of animals and the eggs of parasites too small to see. They did not know this. They only knew that mud cooled the skin and made them feel lighter. Some women even collected specific types of soil, dark, wet earth from shaded places, believing it to have stronger healing powers. They carried it home in small wooden buckets and kept it beside the door, ready for the next cleansing. In the evenings, when work was done, they sat outside and smeared it over their hands and feet, laughing quietly at how smooth the skin felt afterward. The act was passed from mother to daughter. A child learned early to rub mud between her fingers, to spread it along her arms, to scrape it off when it dried. The sensation became comforting, almost ritualistic, like saying a prayer without words. When illness came, they used it not just for hygiene but as a cure. They pressed the cool mud against feverish skin, against insect bites, against the swell of infected wounds. The relief was temporary, but temporary was enough in a world where lasting comfort did not exist. Sometimes, the mud clung for too long, trapped beneath layers of fabric where the air could not reach. It mixed with sweat and oil, creating a thick film that sealed the skin. The smell was heavy and earthy, following them wherever they went. Yet within the village, that smell was unremarkable. Everyone carried it, men and women alike, so no one noticed. If someone today stood near them, the odour alone would drive them back. Yet for those women it was the scent of familiarity, of belonging. Cleanliness was not about fragrance, but about faith in what they could touch. The illusion of cleanliness gave them courage. Covered in mud, they felt protected, as though the layer of earth was armour against invisible harm. In a time when sickness spread like fog through villages, any form of defence was worth believing in. They did not fear germs because they did not know they existed. They feared bad air, curses, and imbalance in the body. To them, mud was a shield, a small act of defiance against decay. The more they covered themselves, the safer they felt, even as the danger seeped deeper into their pores. During the colder months, when rivers froze and baths were impossible, they still sought mud wherever they could find it. They dug through frozen fields to reach damp soil, warmed it near the fire, and spread it over their skin like salve. The mud hardened faster in the heat, and when they scraped it off, it left streaks of grey across their arms and faces. The skin beneath was dry and cracking, but they saw that as proof of purification. The pain was a reassurance that the body had expelled something unclean. Their husbands and sons joined in sometimes, especially after long days in the fields. They too smeared the mud over their backs and arms, laughing at how it flaked off like dust. The practice united them in the same illusion, the belief that the land that fed them also washed them clean. Even when infections appeared, boils, rashes, or strange spots on the skin, they called it the body healing itself. They never questioned the cause, because questioning meant losing faith in the only protection they had. The cottages reeked faintly of damp earth. Bits of dried mud fell from their clothes and scattered across the floor. When they slept, traces of it rubbed onto straw bedding, grinding into their blankets. The sheets became dark and rough, crusted with layers of earth that refused to leave. Washing them would have required water, and water was a precious resource saved for drinking and cooking. So the mud stayed, turning the home itself into an extension of the soil outside. To live clean was to live close to the ground, and they took pride in that nearness. When travellers passed through and wrinkled their noses at the sight, the villagers dismissed them as soft. To the peasants, the earth was mother and medicine alike. Even when sores opened or worms wriggled beneath the skin, they did not connect suffering to their habits. Illness was not dirt's fault. It was the will of nature, or punishment for laziness. So they continued their routines, day after day, painting their bodies with the same mud that filled their graves. The ritual had a rhythm that matched their lives, slow, repetitive, unchanged across generations. The mud-covered scars and bruises made them invisible for a while. It was a comfort to hide the marks of labour under something that felt like care. The women whispered that it made their skin soft, though beneath the grey coating it was rough and dry. They smiled faintly as they worked it into their arms, taking pride in the strength that dirt represented. By the time they finished, the lines of their faces were masked in pale brown. When they smiled, cracks spread across the dried surface like broken clay. The transformation was both strange and beautiful in its own way, an imitation of cleanliness achieved through filth. It was a reminder that even in poverty, they sought dignity through whatever means they had. The difference between soap and mud was only wealth, and wealth was something the earth never gave freely. At the end of the day, as the sun sank behind the fields, they stood near the river once more, scraping away the last of the mud and watching it return to the water. The surface rippled, swallowing their reflections, and for a brief moment, they looked almost clean. Then they turned home, carrying the same soil on their hands, the same dust in their hair, ready to begin the ritual again tomorrow. The women who trusted the mud believed it cleansed them of sickness, yet it only drew them deeper into it. Their faith in the earth was both their comfort and their curse. The same hands that spread that cooling paste across their bodies would, before long, reach for another jar, one filled not with soil but with something far worse, a substance whose stench of rot clung to both skin and soul alike. Childbirth for peasant women was an act of endurance carried out in silence, often without help, and recovery was treated as another chore to survive. When the pain of birth passed, the body was left torn and trembling, but there were no clean sheets, no midwives with herbs or soothing oils. What they had instead was old rice wine, soured and sharp, kept in earthen jars by the stove. It was believed to cleanse and seal wounds, to burn away the evil air that entered the body during birth. The women poured it over themselves or rubbed it in with rough cloths, wincing at the sting but trusting the fire in the liquid to purify. The smell filled the room, a mixture of blood, smoke, and alcohol gone bad. The rice wine they used was never fresh. It was the leftover liquid from earlier months, thickened and cloudy, often crawling with the beginnings of mould. Some jars had turned brown or yellow with age, yet no one saw this as a problem. The stronger the smell, the better it was believed to work. They called it old fire, a gift that fought decay. When they applied it, The warmth turned quickly to pain. The raw skin burned, tears mixed with the sour liquid, and the pain became unbearable. But still, they pressed on. It is almost cruelly ironic that what they thought of as cleansing was in truth infection disguised as devotion. The fire that was meant to heal only deepened the wounds. Water was not used, not because it was unavailable, but because it was feared. They believed washing after childbirth would allow bad air to enter through open flesh, bringing fever or even death. The body had to stay sealed, and so they sealed it with rot. The wine soaked into the wounds, leaving behind a thin crust that they mistook for healing. The scent lingered for days, sweet and sour, mixing with milk and sweat. In that smell, they found reassurance that the body was still alive, still fighting. There were no clean clothes to use. Whatever rags they had were reused, stained and rough from washing in cold, dirty water. They folded them over and pressed them against their skin to stop bleeding, then dipped them again in the rice wine for the next round. Infection came easily. The cuts turned red, then dark, and pus gathered in the folds of fabric. The pain spread slowly, but they accepted it as part of recovery. They told themselves that the body must purge before it could mend, and if fever came, it meant the bad air was leaving. If someone today saw this, they would call it torture. Yet to these women it was care in its purest form. When fevers rose, the family gathered around helplessly. The mother burned while the baby slept beside her, and no one understood the cause. They poured more wine on her body, whispering that it would drive out the sickness. Sometimes she recovered, sometimes she didn't. Death after childbirth was so common that it no longer shocked anyone. The same jar of rice wine that had burned one woman's wounds would be used again for the next, as though the liquid could not carry death within it. To them, wine was sacred. It had to heal, because nothing else could. The wounds that healed left scars that never softened. The skin thickened, puckered, and sometimes fused unevenly, leaving behind pain that lasted for years. Some women could barely sit without discomfort, yet they returned to work within days, hauling water, cooking, and tending to fields with bodies still bleeding. Rest was a privilege of the rich. In their world, healing had to happen while the hands kept moving. The rice wine jar sat near the door, ready to be used again whenever another child was born, another woman broken open. The smell of fermenting rice clung to everything. It lingered on blankets, in the baby's clothes, even in the air they breathed. Visitors noticed it first, the sharp, sour note of decay, and yet within the home, it was a scent of comfort. It meant the ritual had been done, that the mother had done all she could to protect herself. It was a symbol of care within the limits of poverty. There was no understanding of bacteria, only belief, and belief was often stronger than truth. The jars themselves were old, cracked along the sides, their rims coated in residue. Dust and insects gathered there, but no one cleaned them. Each jar carried memory, the births of children, the deaths of mothers. Some were refilled year after year, the wine within darkening until it resembled oil. The women dipped their fingers in it like a blessing, never questioning what it had become. They could not afford to. To doubt tradition was to face fear alone, and fear without hope was unbearable. When pain became too much, they lay beside the fire, pressing their hands between their legs to feel if the warmth remained. The wounds ached, the fever pulsed, and still they whispered thanks for the wine that had saved them. Some drank a little of it too, believing that healing must happen both inside and out. The bitterness burned their throats, making them cough, but they smiled through it. Pain was a familiar friend. It meant they were still alive. Over time, some women lost the ability to bear more children. Their bodies, ravaged by infection, closed against life. Others lived with chronic pain, though they would never name it. They called it the ache of motherhood and carried on. Their lives were cycles of birth, bleeding, burning, and endurance. The same rituals that destroyed them were the ones that gave them meaning. They did not know that the rice wine's bite came not from purity but from decay. The same sourness they trusted as strength was the taste of corruption. Each generation inherited both the knowledge and the ignorance of the one before. The women handed down jars like heirlooms, teaching their daughters to trust what had killed their mothers. In that quiet repetition lay both their resilience and their tragedy. The women who used fermented wine to heal themselves believed they were guarding life, yet they were only feeding the wounds that would never close. Their devotion to the ritual was born from love, but love, in their world, always carried pain. The same hands that poured the sour liquid would soon reach for something else to ease their scent and keep away shame. A new method of masking decay that came from the fires of their own hearth. Among peasant women, smell was a constant companion, and sweat was not something to be hidden, but managed in whatever crude ways they knew. There were no perfumes, no soaps, and no fresh linen to disguise the scent of labour. Instead, they turned to the ashes of their fires. Charcoal from the hearth, once used to cook their meals, became their chosen remedy against the odours of the body. They believed that what came from the fire could purify what the body released. The same hands that stirred soup and shovelled coal would later crush the cooled embers into fine dust, black and soft, then rub it beneath their arms with the hope that it would draw away the smell of sweat. The act was simple but harsh. The powder was dry and sharp, scraping the tender skin under the arms until it burned. The black residue clung to every crease, leaving dark streaks that stained their clothes. But the women considered the sting a sign that the remedy was working. The pain meant that something inside was being drawn out, that the dirt and odour were being replaced with the purity of fire's remains. It is almost darkly humorous that they thought the ashes of their kitchens could burn away what only water could wash. For them, discomfort was a fair price for the illusion of cleanliness. Some went further, mixing the charcoal with ashes and, at times, with their own urine. They believed the ammonia's acrid bite increased the power of the mixture, making it more effective in drying the skin. The smell, sharp and heavy, filled the air around them, yet they accepted it without flinching. Their senses had long since adapted to worse. They rubbed the gritty paste under their arms, feeling it bite into the skin, and waited for it to dry. The mixture hardened into a dark crust that cracked as they moved, leaving behind streaks on their skin like soot from a chimney. The residue built up over days, forming layers that could not easily be removed. It darkened their armpits permanently, the skin becoming rough and thick from irritation. Some women carried these black stains like invisible marks of effort. To them, they were proof of endurance, not shame. If someone today saw those stains, they might think of neglect, but to those women, it meant discipline, the daily battle against the scent of poverty. The smell of charcoal was far preferable to the sourness of sweat, and it clung more firmly, merging with the smoky air of their cottages until it became part of their identity. The process often caused small wounds. The abrasiveness of the ash cut into pores, leaving them open to infection. The skin swelled, blistered, and peeled. But the women did not stop. To complain would be to admit vanity, and vanity was considered foolishness among the poor. They endured the pain as they endured everything else, with quiet resignation. The soot became a second skin, hiding their exhaustion beneath a thin layer of black. For them, cleanliness was not the absence of dirt, but the act of fighting it, even if the fight left new scars. The irony was bitter. Their attempts to appear cleaner only made them more marked by filth. Yet that contrast defined their lives. Hardship disguised as care, suffering mistaken for strength. The charcoal rubbed beneath their arms was no different from the weight of the rags they wore, or the mud on their faces. It was all part of the same fragile ritual of survival. When they gathered in groups, working in the fields or carrying baskets through the village, the faint scent of smoke followed them. It mixed with the smell of straw, of livestock, of damp earth, forming an aroma so familiar that no one thought twice about it. They spoke of how the ashes kept them pure, how it protected them from sickness, how it made the body smell like home instead of decay. These small comforts mattered more than truth. No one wanted to believe that the remedy they trusted might be harming. The jars that held the charcoal were kept close to the hearth, always warm from the fire. They were simple clay containers, blackened by years of smoke, filled with fine grey dust. When the jar emptied, they scraped new ash from the base of the cooking pit, sifted it with their fingers, and stored it again. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet satisfaction in turning the remnants of daily life into something useful. In poverty, even the ashes of burned wood held value. In winter, when the air grew heavy and their cottages closed against the cold, the smell of old sweat and soot became unbearable to outsiders. But to those who lived in it, the odour was comforting, a reminder of warmth and life inside walls that had little else to offer. The black powder stained their clothing, marked their beds, and left faint streaks on their children's faces when they held them close. It was everywhere, unavoidable, but it was theirs. The irritation beneath their arms sometimes spread, causing pain that lasted for weeks. When the swelling grew worse, they treated it with more ash, believing the cure must lie in the same substance that caused it. They were trapped in a cycle of self-inflicted harm hidden beneath the language of cleanliness, yet they spoke of it with pride, boasting of how long they could go without smelling foul. The pain became a measure of endurance, the sting a reminder that they were still fighting against decay, still trying to rise above the dirt that defined their lives. There is something tragic about how human beings can learn to mistake damage for devotion. When night fell, they sat close to the fire, the smell of ash and heat mingling in the air. Their arms itched, their clothes carried streaks of grey, and yet they felt clean. In the flickering light, the soot on their skin glimmered faintly, like a shadow turned to armour. They closed their eyes and breathed in the same smoke that had marked them, comforted by the thought that the fire that fed them by day still guarded them by night. The black dust beneath their arms was their small triumph against a world that offered no mercy. It was a defence made of fire's remains, of belief stronger than reason. In their struggle for purity, they had turned their bodies into altars of ash, and when the stinging grew unbearable, they sought another form of cleansing, one that promised freshness through water once more, though even the water itself was far from clean. Laundry for peasant women was not a task of cleanliness, but a duty of necessity. The same hands that fed animals, carried dung, and pulled weeds were the ones that washed the clothes their families wore every day. There were no wells of clear water, no soap, and no basins filled with steam. Instead, there were shallow ditches that ran through the edges of the fields, ditches where cattle drank, where waste from the barns flowed, where insects swarmed over the surface. This was where they brought their garments, heavy with sweat and soil. The water was brown and sluggish, a mixture of mud, manure, and decay. Still, to them, it was enough. Anything that wet the fabric was considered clean. They crouched by the banks, skirts pulled to their knees, dipping the bundles into the thick water. The smell rose sharply, the sour sting of rot filling the air, but they barely noticed. The habit was older than memory. They slapped the clothes against rocks, rubbed them between their palms, and watched the dirty water turn darker, mistaking the act itself for purification. It is bitterly amusing that washing, the symbol of cleanliness, could look so much like soaking filth in filth. Yet, for them, the rhythm of scrubbing was what mattered, not the result. The sound of fabric hitting stone meant they were doing their part. Soap was an unimaginable luxury. The few who had seen it spoke of it like magic, something soft and white that only the wealthy could afford. For the rest, washing was done with bare hands and cold water. They rubbed the fibres until their fingers cracked, rinsed them briefly, and wrung them dry. The stains remained, dark patches of life that never left. When the clothes were hung across fences or low branches, the breeze carried the faint scent of the ditch through the village. To outsiders, it was foul. To the peasants, it was the smell of effort, of a job completed. The water left residue behind, a film that stiffened as it dried. Once the garments were brought home, they felt rough and hard, as though coated in dust. When worn again, they scratched the skin, leaving red marks where the fabric rubbed against the body. But no one complained. The roughness meant the clothes were strong, and strength mattered more than comfort. If someone today were to touch those garments, they might recoil. But for these women, stiffness was the closest thing to purity. To them, softness belonged to those who did not work. As they washed, insects gathered on the surface of the ditch. Small frogs jumped between their feet, and the murky water swirled with floating straw and fragments of waste. Sometimes a cow would wander too close, stirring the water into a frothy mess. The women only laughed, pushing the animal away with their elbows before continuing. The idea of pollution did not exist for them. What mattered was the gesture of washing, not what was in the water. Their world was too full of dirt to ever fear it. They washed everything in the same place: shirts, skirts, rags for bleeding, and sometimes even the cloths used for childbirth. The separation between clean and unclean had no meaning. When they returned home, they hung the dripping clothes near the hearth, where the smoke would dry them faster. The air filled with a sour, animal scent, mingling with the smell of burning wood. The children played among the hanging garments, their laughter rising over the hiss of boiling stew, while droplets of ditch water fell slowly onto the packed earth floor. When the clothes were dry, they were stiff as bark. Folding them felt like bending paper. The edges scratched against the skin, and the smell lingered, acrid, fermented, never truly gone. Yet the women took quiet pride in their work. They had scrubbed, they had dried, they had done their duty. There was no higher standard to meet. There is something quietly tragic about how survival teaches people to confuse effort with cleanliness. For them, the act itself was enough to erase guilt, even if it could not erase grime. The ditches changed with the seasons. In summer, they were shallow and foul, the heat turning them thick with slime. In winter, the surface froze into brittle layers of ice that cracked underfoot. The women broke the ice with sticks and washed their clothes beneath it, their hands turning numb in seconds. They never stopped. The rhythm of the act kept them warm, even as their fingers bled. Their skin hardened like leather, their nails blackened from the cold. Yet they believed the cold itself had a cleansing power. Pain was part of the process, and anything that hurt was assumed to heal. The same ditch water soaked the rags that wiped their tables and the clothes they wrapped around their children. Illness spread quietly, but no one thought to link it to the water. They blamed the weather, or fate, or the spirits that ruled the air. The concept of invisible sickness was too distant to imagine. The only truth they knew was that washing made them respectable. Even if the result was filth, they would rather wear a garment rinsed in dung than be seen with one that had not been washed at all. By nightfall, when the day's labour ended, the smell of wet fabric still lingered in their homes. It mixed with smoke, sweat, and the faint sweetness of fermenting grain. The garments hung close to the fire, curling at the edges as they dried. The women rubbed their aching arms and watched the fabric stiffen again, satisfied. To them, the harshness meant cleanliness, the scent of manure meant renewal, and the dirt at the bottom of the ditch meant life continuing as it always had. The women who washed in filth believed they were cleansing themselves from the weight of labour, yet they were only wrapping that filth back around their bodies. The same hands that wrung out the water would soon reach into the same ditches for the next day's load. and when the washing was done, and the air smelled of smoke and dung, they would turn once again to the mirror of their bodies, scraping away what the dirt had left behind with tools even sharper than the rocks they used to wash. Shaving, for peasant women, was never an act of vanity. It was simply another task, one performed out of practicality and discomfort, not beauty. The same knife that gutted chickens, sliced bread, or scraped dirt from boots was often used to remove unwanted hair. The blade was old, its surface spotted with rust, but it was the only tool available. There were no razors, no mirrors, no ointments to soothe the skin afterward. They squatted near the hearth or behind their cottages, the dim light flickering against the edge of the knife, and began their work. The motion was slow and clumsy, guided not by sight but by touch. They felt the roughness of the hair, pressed the metal to their skin, and scraped until the surface felt smooth. The process was as painful as it was dangerous. Without mirrors, they worked purely by instinct, dragging the blade along the softest parts of their bodies. The sound of scraping mixed with the crackle of fire, the faint rasp of steel against flesh. Small cuts appeared quickly, beading with blood that mixed with sweat. They wiped it away with their fingers, barely noticing the sting. It is disturbingly ironic that the knife that prepared food also drew blood from the body it fed. Yet, to them, it was normal. The smell of iron filled the air, blending with smoke, until the difference between the two disappeared. There was no antiseptic, no clean cloth to stop the bleeding. They pressed rags against their skin, rags that had already been used for cleaning or wiping the floor. Infection came easily. The small cuts swelled within days, turning red and tender. When pus gathered, they simply let it drain, believing it to be the body's way of healing itself. The pain became part of life, another quiet burden to carry. If someone today saw the same blade, they would recoil at its rust, but to those women it was an ordinary object, a household tool for every purpose. They shaved because hair was seen as dirt, a sign of neglect. Smooth skin meant effort, and effort meant decency. Even in poverty, decency mattered. The church preached modesty, and women took those words to heart. Though they had little means to achieve it, they could not afford oils or powders, so they offered blood instead. Each scrape was an act of penance disguised as hygiene. The pain was proof of discipline, a small reminder that the body had to be controlled, no matter how crude the method. Some women boiled the knife before using it, hoping to soften the metal, but the boiling water was rarely clean. Others rubbed the blade on rough stones to sharpen it, unaware that rust flakes lodged deeper into the skin. The wounds that followed were slow to heal, forming dark scars that never truly faded. Still, they continued. The routine gave them a sense of order in a world ruled by filth and hardship. Shaving was a way to impose will upon the body, to feel a fragment of control. Without mirrors, they trusted their fingertips. They ran their hands along their thighs, their arms, and their bellies, searching for smoothness. In winter, when the cold numbed their fingers, they worked faster, careless of the nicks. The knife slipped often, and sometimes a deep cut bled for hours. They wrapped the wound in scraps of cloth, tied tightly until the bleeding stopped. The scar that remained became a quiet mark of endurance. To them, pain was the price of being proper. The knife was not theirs alone. It belonged to the household, passed from task to task, blade to body, without distinction. In the morning, it might be used to slice meat. By afternoon, it scraped the calluses from heels or shaved hair from armpits and groin. At night, it returned to the table, wiped once with a rag, and was left ready for tomorrow. Its handle was worn smooth from years of use, its edge dulled and jagged, but it remained essential. Every peasant home had one, and it served every purpose. When infection spread too far, when the fever came and the skin turned dark, the women turned to folk cures, They smeared mud or animal fat over the wounds, believing it would draw out the sickness. The fat sealed the cut, trapping the infection beneath. Some survived, others did not. Death from such wounds was not spoken of with horror but with acceptance. To die from a tool of daily life seemed almost natural. After all, everything they owned could kill them in the right conditions: the water, the food, even the air. The smell of rust lingered on their skin long after the act was done. The blood dried, forming tiny crusts that rubbed against fabric. The sensation was sharp at first, then dull. Within a day, they forgot the pain entirely. The hair would grow back soon enough, coarse and dark, demanding the same ritual again. There was no escape from repetition. The cycle of cutting, bleeding, and healing became as regular as eating. Each wound was a small echo of survival, a reminder of the narrow line between care and harm. Their daughters learned the same method, watching quietly as their mothers crouched near the fire, knife in hand. They learned when to stop before the blade dug too deep, when to press cloth against bleeding, and when to endure the sting. By the time they reached womanhood, the act felt instinctive, part of the rhythm of living poor. To question it was unthinkable. In their world, tradition carried more authority than comfort. When the knife dulled too far to cut, they rubbed it harder, pressing with more force. The sound grew harsher, the pain sharper. Each cut became a kind of offering, a small sacrifice to the idea of decency. The body was not theirs to pamper, it was theirs to discipline. Every scar, every wound was proof of effort, a physical testimony to cleanliness earned through blood. The same blade that had touched the bodies of animals and humans alike became the symbol of how survival blurred every boundary. The women who used it believed they were purifying themselves, yet each stroke carried more filth back into their skin. And when the bleeding finally stopped, and their hands grew still, they reached for a single cloth to wipe the blade clean, a cloth shared by the whole family, one that would pass once more from hand to hand, carrying traces of every life it touched. In a peasant household, the idea of personal belongings barely existed. Everything was shared: the fire, the food, the bed, and even the means to keep clean. A single piece of cloth, rough and dark from years of use, hung near the hearth. It was the household towel, though no one called it that. It served every purpose imaginable: wiping hands after tending animals, cleaning faces smudged with ash, drying pots slick with grease, or mopping spills from the table. The fabric absorbed everything, from water and sweat to oil and dirt. No one questioned its condition. Its presence alone meant the house was complete. The cloth was rarely, if ever, washed. When it grew too wet or heavy, it was hung closer to the fire to dry. The heat hardened it, stiffening the fabric until it resembled hide more than linen. Bits of food clung to its surface, and the smell of smoke and rot mixed into a constant staleness that filled the kitchen. Yet this was the scent of home. The family reached for it without thought, wiping the same spots that others had touched moments earlier. It is almost absurd to think that what they believed kept them clean was the very thing that spread their filth further. But habits, once rooted in survival, were hard to see as mistakes. Every household had such a rag. Sometimes it was a strip of an old skirt, a cut of flour sack. It hung from a wooden peg, blackened with soot from the hearth, always within reach. After cooking, the mother wiped her hands on it, leaving streaks of grease. The children followed, smearing mud and porridge across the same surface. The father might use it next, drying his hands after sharpening tools or cleaning his boots. The cloth accepted all without judgment. It was the silent witness to their daily life, carrying the history of every touch. When guests arrived, the rag was sometimes rinsed quickly in a bucket, wrung out and hung back in place, as though a token gesture could erase years of grime. The water used for rinsing turned grey, filled with floating bits of ash and fat, but the family felt reassured. Cleanliness, to them, was not about removing dirt but performing the act of care. If someone today stepped into that kitchen, they would see infection in every thread. Yet for those families, it was a symbol of order, proof that life still held routine. The damp fabric never truly dried. It held moisture deep within, breeding an invisible life of its own. Flies often gathered near it, drawn by the sour scent, but no one chased them away. They were part of the air, part of the rhythm of the place. When fever swept through a village, no one suspected the rag hanging quietly by the fire. They spoke instead of bad winds or curses, never realizing that sickness passed daily from hand to cloth and back again. The children wiped their mouths on it after eating, their faces streaked with soot and crumbs. Babies had their noses cleaned with the same edge that dried cooking pots. When one child fell ill, the same cloth continued to circle through the household, binding them together in both affection and disease. There was comfort in its presence, a shared tool that felt like part of the family itself. No one could imagine the home without it. Over time, the rag lost its original colour. It became a deep, unidentifiable shade between brown and black. The weave frayed, threads loosening and curling like hair. Yet even when it began to fall apart, it was not discarded. Pieces were torn from it to make smaller rags, one for the table, one for cleaning shoes, and one for wiping the baby. Each fragment carried the same history, spreading it further. The thought of burning or replacing it seemed wasteful, almost disrespectful to something that had served so long. In winter, when the smoke from the hearth grew thick, the cloth absorbed it until it smelled of burnt wood and animal fat. The family barely noticed. The odour was familiar, woven into the fabric of their lives. They might press it to their faces to wipe away sweat, not realizing they were pressing years of decay against their skin. The texture was coarse, but they found comfort in its warmth. To touch it was to feel the home itself. The cloth's presence represented more than neglect. It was the embodiment of survival through poverty. Washing it required water, and water required time, fire, and strength. Those things were too valuable to spend on a piece of fabric, so they lived with what they had, adapting to the constant cycle of dirt that began and ended in the same square of cloth. It was not ignorance, but acceptance. In their minds, there was no other way to live. There is something deeply unsettling in how human beings can grow fond of the very things that harm them, mistaking familiarity for safety. At night, when the fire dimmed and the family sat close together, the rag still hung in its place, swaying slightly in the smoke. It would be used again in the morning, and again after that, until it disintegrated completely. By then, a new one would take its place, cut from another worn-out garment, ready to absorb another generation's dirt. The families who shared that single cloth believed it connected them, a simple tool, passed from hand to hand. In truth, it tied them in a loop of quiet contamination. Yet even as the air thickened with its smell, they kept it near the heart of the home, believing it to be harmless. And while it hung there, the illusion of cleanliness endured, waiting for the day when the search for purity would move from fabric to the very hair on their heads, where soot and grease found their own dark sanctuary. Hair, for peasant women, was both burden and pride. It was a mark of femininity, yet a nuisance that required constant tending in lives already heavy with labour. There were no combs of ivory or scented oils to smooth it, only the coarse fingers of their own hands and what the hearth provided, ash and fat. From these, they created their own mixture, a dark, oily paste that promised control. The ash kept the strands heavy and still, while the fat gave the illusion of shine. Together they formed a crude substitute for pomade, born not of vanity but of need. Loose hair was impractical. It caught in the wind, in branches, and in fire. Bound hair meant order, and order meant decency. The process began at dawn, near the same fire that blackened their pots. They gathered a handful of cold ash, sifting it through their palms to remove large cinders, then mixed it with a spoonful of congealed pig fat. The smell rose immediately, sour, smoky, and thick. They rubbed it between their fingers until it softened, then worked it into their hair, part by part, pressing it down to the scalp. The mixture clung to every strand, coating it in grey dust. Within minutes, the hair turned heavy, matte, and stiff. But to the women, this weight was a comfort. It is almost laughable that they mistook the dullness of ash for the cleanliness of order. The tighter the hair stayed in place, the better they felt. The matted strands stuck close to the skin, sealing in sweat. After hours of work in the fields, the mixture grew warm under the sun, melting into an oily film that ran down their necks. The smell of fat followed them everywhere, clinging to their clothes and beds, yet they accepted it. The scent was not shameful. It was a sign of care, of having taken time to keep the hair neat. If someone today caught that smell, they might flinch. But for those women, it was simply the perfume of effort. The odour of ash and animal fat was part of every home, woven into the fabric of daily life. At night, when they loosened their hair to rest, flakes of ash fell to the ground like dust from old wood. The scalp itched where the mixture had dried, and small red bumps appeared beneath the hairline. They scratched absently, their nails dark from dirt, opening tiny wounds that stung in the heat. The next morning, the process began again. There was no thought of washing it away. To wash meant to undo effort, to waste both time and warmth. Instead, they added more ash to absorb the oil, more fat to smooth the flakes, layering decay over decay until the texture of their hair resembled the soil itself. The build-up grew thicker with each passing day. The hair, once dark or fair, lost its colour beneath layers of soot and grease. It stiffened like a rope, unyielding to movement. When lice found their way in, they thrived, feeding on the warmth of the scalp. The women combed with wooden pins or simply picked through with their fingers, crushing the insects against the roots. The act was unpleasant, but it was private, done quietly by the fire while others looked away. Shame had no place here. Everyone lived the same way. The ash gave their hair a peculiar texture, rough yet slick. It caught light strangely, dull in the shadows but gleaming near flame, giving them a ghostly look in the dimness of their cottages. When they went to church, they covered it with scarves, not out of modesty but practicality. The smell of old fat was strongest in the warmth of crowds. Underneath the cloth, their hair stayed damp, pressed tightly to their heads. The heat made it throb, and the scalp beneath turned red and raw. But this discomfort was normal, even reassuring. It meant the mixture was doing its job, keeping the hair in place. The belief in ash and fat ran deep. Mothers taught their daughters how to prepare the mixture just right, the proportion of soot to grease, the proper time to apply it, and the way to wrap the hair afterward. It was considered wisdom, not superstition. A well-kept bun showed diligence, and diligence was a virtue. Even when it caused sores or hair loss, they persisted. To appear dishevelled was worse than to suffer. The sight of loose strands carried the quiet accusation of laziness, and laziness was sin. In summer, the heat made the mixture rancid faster. Flies gathered near their heads as they worked, buzzing around the sour smell. Still, they ignored it. The flies were everywhere, and the women had long stopped distinguishing their sources. Sometimes, in moments of rest, they could feel the fat harden on their skin, tightening like wax. They scratched at the edges, but the residue always returned. The scalp became a patchwork of scabs and dirt, the hair above it an unmovable crown of grease and ash. There was an odd pride in it, too. The bun that did not loosen through an entire day's work was a sign of competence. When they walked home from the fields, their heads high and hair unmoving, it meant they had mastered something, however small, against the chaos of life. There is something deeply human about finding pride in endurance, even when it reeks of decay. In their eyes, the hair that stayed still under wind and rain proved that they were strong, that they still cared enough to keep some part of themselves in order. By night, when they lay beside their husbands, the smell of smoke and fat mingled with the air, coating everything they touched. Pillows darkened, blankets absorbed the grease, and even the walls seemed to glisten faintly under the firelight. The air was thick but warm, and within that warmth they slept soundly, unbothered by what their bodies carried. Cleanliness had long since become not a condition, but an illusion, a story they told themselves to feel safe in the dirt that defined them. The women who smeared ash and grease into their hair believed they were keeping beauty alive in small, humble ways, yet each layer only drew them deeper into filth disguised as care. Their hair, heavy and unmoving, mirrored the stillness of lives pressed under centuries of hardship. The same fire that provided their ashes would soon serve another purpose, boiling what little water they had, not for comfort but for survival. Beneath that smoke-filled heat, thirst and habit would meet in a grim choice, one that revealed how even water could betray them. Water was both life and danger in the world of peasant women. Every drop came at a cost. To boil it meant fire, and to make fire meant wood, something not easily spared. The nearest trees grew far from the village, deep in the forest, where gathering meant hours of walking with bundles on the back, feet raw, and shoulders bent beneath the weight. The fuel was precious, saved for cooking or warmth. So when thirst came, they drank what they had, straight from the earth itself. In the puddles near their fields or the ponds where animals drank, they filled their jugs without hesitation. The water looked cloudy, often lined with green film or specks of floating debris. Yet to them, it was just another piece of the land. Dirty, perhaps, but familiar, and familiarity made it safe. Some women scooped the water from shallow ditches where rain had collected, clear only at the top, thick with silt below. They poured it through a scrap of cloth, believing that the filtering was enough. The cloth, of course, was unwashed and crusted from past use. Sometimes, small larvae floated inside the pot, spinning slowly as the women lifted it to their lips. They drank anyway. The coolness soothed the throat after hours in the sun. It is grimly amusing that what they called refreshment was little more than disease disguised as relief. But in a world where choice was rare, even risk became routine. The smell of the water varied. On some days it carried the faint sweetness of decay. On others the sharp taste of iron or the bitterness of mud. Their stomachs twisted after drinking, but they rarely noticed any more. The cramps were as common as hunger, and hunger was constant. Children often grew thin and pale, their bellies swelling from worms. Mothers whispered prayers, blaming the sky or fate rather than the water itself. In modern times, people buy filters and bottled water with labels promising purity. Yet those peasant women trusted puddles and ditches as though the land itself would protect them. They did not see danger in what was everywhere around them. When rain came, it felt like a blessing. They left jars outside to catch it, standing under the open sky. But even rain carried dust from the air, mixing with the smoke of their fires and the ashes of their homes. The first drops were blackened, the rest faintly sour. Still, they stored it carefully, covering the top with bits of cloth to keep out insects. Days later, when they uncovered it, the surface shimmered with thin green patches. That sight no longer frightened them. A quick stir and the water was ready to drink again. The first sip was cool, almost pleasant, until it left a strange metallic taste behind. For them, water was not about cleanliness, but about survival. They used it to knead dough, to wash vegetables, to clean wounds, all from the same source. When illness came, fever, vomiting, or the endless churn of the stomach, They said it was God's will or bad air from the marshes. They saw no link between what they drank and how they suffered. Boiling water was a luxury, something for the sick or the newborn, not for daily life. To use fire for water felt wasteful when mouths needed food and nights needed warmth. The logic was simple: fire saved lives only when it cooked something solid. The rivers and ponds became part of their bodies in ways they never realized. Their skins smelled faintly of the same stagnant water they drank. It seeped into their clothes, their hair, their food. Even the babies fed from their milk carried traces of the land's contamination. The women spoke of strong stomachs as a matter of pride, boasting that they could drink anything without harm. But their resilience was an illusion. Beneath it lay exhaustion and sickness that dulled slowly over time until no one remembered what health felt like. Sometimes travellers passing through offered advice: boil the water, strain it with sand, let it settle before drinking. The women listened politely, nodding, but few changed their ways. Advice required effort, and effort required time, and time was a thing already taken by work. The rhythm of survival left no room for refinement. There is a strange calm in seeing how people can adapt to danger so completely that it no longer frightens them. What others would call unthinkable became ordinary, even comforting in its repetition. On summer evenings, the ponds grew thick with insects. Their wings danced above the surface, and the women's reflections rippled beneath them. They knelt to fill their pots again, brushing away the bugs but never their eggs. The sun lowered, and in that orange light, the water glowed faintly gold, beautiful in its stillness. Beauty, however, hid the rot beneath. By night, the smell of damp earth clung to everything, creeping into the walls and clothes, a quiet reminder of what they carried inside their bodies. When fevers spread through a household, they called it the work of spirits, or the curse of another village. The truth was simpler: the water they trusted turned against them. Yet still they drank it, because thirst had no patience for logic. The act of drinking was both defiance and surrender, a way of telling themselves that life would continue even if it burned from within. They had no wells lined with stone, no buckets carved clean from wood, only mud and their faith that mud was enough. The water they drank was both cure and poison, relief and ruin. Each sip was a quiet gamble taken in resignation rather than ignorance. Their bodies bore the cost, yet their minds stayed calm, untouched by fear. What mattered was not purity but endurance. The same ponds that reflected the sky in daylight turned black at night, holding secrets they never tried to understand. Somewhere between habit and despair, they learned to live with it, letting sickness blend into normalcy until the two were one. They believed that water, no matter how filthy, was still a gift worth drinking. To them, survival was never about choice but acceptance. The faith that the land would not harm them was what kept them from despair. Beneath that illusion of trust lay the quiet truth of contamination, slowly weaving through their lives, unseen but constant. The same faith that guided their hands to drink from those ponds would soon guide their wounded hands again toward what they thought could heal. Leaves and herbs pressed against their skin in a final attempt to fight the unseen rot within. When wounds appeared on the hands and legs of peasant women, they were treated not with medicine but with the patience of habit. The fields, tools, and daily chores made injury inevitable. Cuts came from sickles, burns from cooking fires, and scrapes from coarse fabric or rough ground. There were no bandages, no clean water, and no doctor within reach. The body was expected to heal itself, and if it did not, the land would provide something, leaves, soil, or smoke, to help it along. It was not medicine in the modern sense, but faith, a faith shaped by necessity rather than choice. They gathered leaves from whatever plants grew nearby. Some were soft, others sharp-edged, but all were believed to hold healing power. The leaves were crushed between their palms or chewed to release juice. then pressed against open wounds. Flies circled lazily as they worked, drawn by the smell of blood and earth. The leaves darkened quickly, sticking to the skin in uneven patches. When they dried, the women replaced them with fresh ones, layering nature over infection. It seems almost darkly humorous that they trusted dirt-covered leaves more than clean air. But belief was stronger than knowledge, and belief was all they had. Sometimes the wounds throbbed for days. Pus built beneath the skin, thick and yellow, pushing against the surface until it split. They did not flinch at the sight. Infection was no stranger. With small knives dulled by use or blades meant for slaughtering chickens, they sliced open the swelling and let it drain. The pain was sharp but fleeting, followed by a sense of relief. The knife was never washed afterward. It went back to its place among other tools, ready for work or another wound. Blood dried on its edge like rust. In their minds, the leaves drew out the poison. They whispered about bad spirits trapped inside the flesh, believing the greenery could absorb their anger. The ritual was quiet, almost reverent. A daughter might hold her mother's arm steady while the leaf was applied, both of them watching for signs of improvement. When the swelling lessened, they praised the plant. When it worsened, they blamed the body for weakness. Today, people use antiseptics and sterile gauze without thought. Yet those women lived in a world where even pain carried faith. They believed in their remedies because the alternative was to admit helplessness, and helplessness was more frightening than death. The smell of infection was a familiar one. In the heat of summer, it filled their homes with a sour, metallic odour that clung to everything. The skin around the wounds grew dark, streaked with red lines spreading upward. Some lost fingers or toes quietly, as if such losses were part of the natural order. They wrapped what remained with old rags, hid it beneath layers of clothing, and continued their work. Life allowed no pause for healing. Fields needed tending, meals needed cooking, and bodies were just another tool that could be patched and used again. At night, the wounds ached more fiercely. The woman lay awake, feeling the pulse of infection beating under the skin. They reached for the leaves beside their beds, replacing them in the dim glow of the fire. Sometimes they used warm ashes mixed with fat to keep the leaves soft. The mixture stung but numbed the area for a while. The next morning, when they peeled the covering away, bits of skin came with it. The wound looked cleaner to them, though it was only stripped raw. What mattered was the act itself, the effort to care, however small. There is something quietly human in that, the will to heal with whatever the earth gives, even when the earth is what caused the wound. The practice passed from one generation to the next. Mothers taught daughters which leaves were gentle and which were strong. They warned about certain plants said to burn the skin, but the warnings blurred over time. What began as caution became tradition, and tradition became truth. In some villages, the same leaves were used for both healing and cooking, their purposes as mixed as the tools that touched them. The women spoke proudly of their remedies, comparing which combinations worked best, though few ever truly healed. The leaves themselves bore the dirt of the fields, the residue of manure and insects. But these were invisible dangers, and what could not be seen could not be feared. They wiped the dust away with the same hands that dug in soil, convinced that cleanliness was a matter of effort, not reality. The act of pressing something green against something red looked like care, and that appearance was enough. It gave comfort to those who had nothing else to rely on. There were moments, too, of quiet horror that no one spoke of. A wound that once seemed small would suddenly turn black at the edges. The flesh hardened, the smell deepened, and within days the person weakened beyond saving. Yet the leaves kept coming, laid gently as offerings, as though nature might forgive its own cruelty. There were no prayers for miracles, only the slow acceptance that bodies failed the way tools did, used too long, worn down beyond repair. For those who survived, scars were badges of endurance. The skin healed unevenly. thick and shiny like wax. The marks were not hidden, they were reminders that life continued. To them, survival itself was proof of the remedy's power. It did not matter whether the leaves truly healed. They symbolized persistence, the quiet refusal to surrender even when the body betrayed them. Their world allowed no distinction between help and harm, only between action and inaction. To do nothing was shameful. To do something, however misguided, meant courage. The leaves were not medicine, but they were proof of care, of faith, of the stubbornness that defined peasant life. The green stains on their fingers told stories no doctor could understand. The belief that plants could heal what steel had damaged was part of the rhythm of survival. Every cut, every burn, every infection carried both pain and a strange sense of pride. To endure was to belong, and to belong was to live. Their leaves, their knives, their quiet rituals of care were not ignorance but inheritance. The habit of trusting the earth, even as it poisoned them, would soon return in another form, one that promised cleansing and comfort, but carried the same dirt within its roots. In the villages where belief replaced science, the act of washing one's face was seen not as cleanliness but as risk. To the peasant women, water touching the skin at dawn could drive away the invisible vital air they called the breath of life. Each morning, they rose with the smoke of their hearths, eyes crusted from sleep, skin slick with the residue of sweat and ash, yet not a drop of water touched their faces. The superstition had hardened into habit long before they were born. Mothers told daughters that those who washed early lost their strength before noon, that water dulled the glow of the soul, so they endured the filth with calm acceptance, mistaking grime for protection and habit for wisdom. The day began with work. Fire was stoked, dough was kneaded, children were fed, and smoke filled every corner of their small rooms. By the time the sun climbed, the women's faces were streaked with soot. The mix of ash and oil from cooking fires clung to their cheeks, blending with the fine dust of the earth that rose from the floor. Sweat formed thin lines through it, leaving pale trails that soon darkened again. It is almost absurd that they believed dirt could guard the spirit while water could destroy it. But in their world, superstition carried the same weight as medicine. By midday, the grime thickened, their foreheads glistened, their skin roughened under the constant layer of dust. They wiped their faces only with the backs of their hands, the same hands that had just scooped soil or fed animals. A brief rub with a sleeve counted as care. No mirrors existed in their homes, and even if one appeared, few would have recognized themselves beneath the coating of labor. Their faces mirrored their fields, cracked, dark, and endlessly worked. In a modern world obsessed with skincare routines, it is almost impossible to imagine a life where not washing is seen as a strength. Yet for them, neglect was endurance, and endurance was pride. The concept of bad air shaped everything. They believed that washing invited sickness by opening the pores to the world's poisons. The morning chill, they said, carried evil into clean skin. So they waited, if ever they washed at all, until night. When work was finished and water had warmed near the hearth, even then, washing meant little more than splashing the face once or twice, more ritual than hygiene. The same water had already been used for dishes or laundry, cloudy with grease and ash, but to them, that was of no concern. Smell and touch replaced the idea of cleanliness. They knew the scent of themselves, smoke, milk, sweat, and soil, and called it normal. Flies hovered, sometimes landing near their eyes or lips, but were brushed away gently, not in disgust but out of routine. Dirt was not an intruder, it was a companion that clung like a second skin. The lines on their faces deepened with time, carved not just by age but by the layers of dust that never left. Their pores were blocked, their skin coarse, yet their eyes still shone with the dull calm of acceptance. Children grew up watching this and learned quickly. Girls imitated their mothers, avoiding morning water, believing that to stay untouched was to preserve something sacred. The first time a girl washed her face early, her mother might scold her softly, warning that her energy would fade, that her beauty would be lost. Beauty, of course, was not about radiance or softness. It was survival. To be strong enough to bear the sun, the wind, and the weight of labour mattered more than appearance. In this way, dirt became part of identity. Sometimes, after long days in the fields, dust clung so thickly that the skin around the eyes turned grey. When they laughed, the cracks in the dirt deepened, splitting like dry earth after rain. The mixture of soot and sweat created a thin crust that stiffened their expressions, giving them a solemn look even when they were not sad. Their lips were often chapped, darkened by smoke and exposure. Still, they wiped them with the same unwashed hands, leaving smudges that faded only when sleep came. I cannot help but think there was a strange sort of beauty in their defiance, an unspoken refusal to bend to the world's rules of purity. They carried their dirt with dignity, like armour made of earth. Illnesses related to the skin and eyes were common. Infections began as small irritations, spreading slowly across cheeks and eyelids. The heat from the hearth made the skin itch, and when they scratched, the dirt beneath their nails only made it worse. Some developed sores that oozed quietly, covered hastily by a cloth or scarf. They did not seek remedies. To them, such suffering was the body's way of releasing evil. Clean water could not have saved them because they did not believe in its saving power. The idea that washing could heal was foreign, something for city people or the wealthy. At the end of the day, when fatigue weighed heavier than superstition, a few might dip a rag into leftover water and dab at their faces. The gesture was small, half-hearted, more an act of cooling than cleansing. The rag was grey from countless uses, its surface coarse, leaving tiny scratches on the skin. The sensation was oddly satisfying, a reminder that they were still alive under all that dust. Afterward, they sat by the fire, letting the warmth dry what little moisture remained. The face returned to its usual dullness, and with it came a sense of order restored. Cleanliness, to them, was not about removal, but endurance. To keep the dirt meant keeping the spirit whole. The face, untouched by water, became a mark of belonging, proof that one lived as all others did, within the same rhythm of superstition and toil. The filth that clung to their cheeks was not seen as shameful. It was a symbol of faith and persistence. Their refusal to wash was more than ignorance. It was loyalty to a belief that had outlived reason, an echo of ancestors who feared invisible forces more than disease itself. The superstition that bound them to their dirt gave comfort, even as it darkened their skin and clouded their eyes. It was an inheritance of fear turned into custom, a quiet lesson in how faith can preserve filth as tradition. They lived and died by these rules, certain that water could harm what dirt had always protected. The same hands that brushed away dust from their cheeks would later reach for that same dust again, this time in the form of powdery rice water, in the belief that even decay could be turned into care. The final act of care among peasant women came from the simplest of rituals, one that looked gentle but carried its own quiet decay. After long days of work, when sweat and dust had hardened on their skin, they turned to the one thing they always had, rice water. It was the leftover water from washing grains, thick and cloudy, stored in clay jars that stood for days until a sour smell began to rise. To them, this scent meant strength. The water, now faintly fermented, was believed to carry the essence of nourishment. They poured it over their heads slowly, letting it run down their hair and necks like a blessing. The cold liquid seeped through the strands, leaving behind a sticky film that clung for hours. The sound of it dripping onto the ground mixed with the quiet crackle of evening fires. The women rubbed their scalps gently, fingers tangling in hair that had not been brushed in days. The sensation was strange, cool at first, then greasy, almost heavy. They said the fermentation made the hair grow stronger, that the sourness was proof of life within the water. No one questioned it. The method had been passed down for generations, from mothers to daughters, with the same conviction as prayer. To refuse it was to abandon tradition, and tradition was all they had. After washing, they sat by the doorways to dry their hair, letting the breeze move through the tangled mass. Flies landed on the wet strands, drawn by the smell, but were brushed away lazily. When the hair dried, it hardened into clumps that crackled when touched. Combs made of wood or bone could barely pass through, catching on knots that pulled at the scalp. Still, the women smiled faintly. They believed the difficulty meant the hair had become thicker. It almost seems darkly comic that what they called beauty was the product of fermentation and grime. But beauty, like health, was not what they sought. It was familiarity, the comfort of doing what had always been done. Sometimes they kept the same batch of rice water for weeks, topping it up with new grains and stirring with their hands. A layer of film formed on top, faintly green, but they did not discard it. They said it grew stronger with time, just like a good brew. When the smell became too sharp, they mixed in herbs or ashes from the hearth, hoping to mask it. The mixture frothed as it touched their skin, leaving small bubbles that clung to the edges of their hairline. When it dried, the bubbles left pale marks that looked like dust. To them, this was a sign that the treatment was working. In truth, the rice water did little more than coat the hair in residue. It trapped dirt beneath it, sealing in the very thing they believed they were washing away. The scalp itched, and sores sometimes formed beneath the layers of film. But these discomforts were familiar, easy to ignore. Pain was a constant companion, a background hum that rarely demanded attention. In modern times, people buy bottles promising shine and strength, while those women poured rot upon their heads with the same hope. The difference lies only in the illusion of progress, not like belief. At night, when they lay down to sleep, the smell of sour rice water filled the air. It mingled with smoke, sweat, and damp fabric, creating a scent unique to their homes, one that clung to walls, bedding, and skin. Their husbands hardly noticed. The same smell lived on their own bodies. The children, growing up surrounded by it, came to associate the odour with comfort. Even decay, when constant, becomes invisible. The next morning, when the women rose, their hair stood stiff around their faces, uneven and brittle. They smoothed it with their palms, pressing it into place until it stayed. Some tied it in knots or simple braids. Others covered it with cloths to keep it from breaking. They believed that rice water gave strength even to the poorest hair. The more they used it, the more convinced they became, though the evidence lay only in the persistence of habit. The belief itself was the result they desired. There was a strange poetry to their ignorance. The same liquid that once nourished the body now served as a balm for vanity, and even when it spoiled, they found new meaning in its decay. To them, nothing was waste. Everything could be transformed. They had learned to live with scarcity so long that even rot became useful. What mattered was not the result, but the repetition, the feeling of doing something to care for themselves, however misguided. In that act lay a quiet dignity. I find it strangely moving how they found beauty in what the world would now call filth. It was not foolishness, but resilience disguised as ritual. As years passed, the smell of fermented rice water remained a part of village life, woven into its rhythm like the smoke from its fires or the dust of its fields. It lingered in the memory of those who survived, mingling with the scent of earth after rain and the bitter taste of poverty. Cleanliness, for them, was not the absence of dirt, but the endurance of it. Their hygiene, so repulsive to modern eyes, was a form of faith. Faith in the body's strength, faith in tradition, faith that what had kept their mothers alive would keep them so too. The story of these women is one of quiet endurance, where ignorance and survival became one. Their habits were not born of laziness but of necessity, shaped by fear, scarcity, and time. The grime on their skin, the sourness of their hair, the dust in their homes, all were marks of a life lived close to the earth, with no barrier between survival and decay. They found purity not in washing but in endurance. What they carried on their skin was history itself, the residue of centuries of poverty, belief, and resilience. And though their ways repulse us now, they were the only truth they knew. In the silence of their huts, amid smoke and fermentation, they lived and aged without ever realizing how the world would one day recoil from their ordinary lives. The rice water that they poured over their heads was the last touch in a cycle of survival, one that mixed decay with devotion. It marked the end of their rituals, the softest gesture in a life of harshness. The fermented scent that rose with the night was their lullaby, the smell of care misunderstood yet deeply felt. Their story ends here, among the jars of sour water and the brittle strands it left behind. Sleep well tonight, and let the whispers of their forgotten world fade into quiet. Good night, traveller of history.